This is Dunkirk, the seaport on the northern coast of France. Today, there are few obvious reminders that it was once the scene of one of the great dramas of the Second World War, the so-called Miracle of Dunkirk, when an entire army was ferried to safety by an armada of British ships. The beaches stretch wide and pale under a quiet sky. Children play where soldiers once bled. The tide comes in and goes out, indifferent to what happened here, as tides always are. It was a glorious defeat that raised the spirits of the British nation but confirmed the superiority of the German army. And its story begins not with generals or politicians, but with two old men who have come back to remember. But more than 60 years after the events that made this place a byword for both catastrophe and deliverance, two old men have come back. One is English, one is German. In May and June of 1940, they were on opposite sides of one of the most desperate episodes of the war. Now, for the first time, they are walking these beaches together. Bob Pendleton was a signalman in the 46th Nottingham Division. Georg Lehrmann served in the 20th Artillery Regiment, one of the German units that pushed the British back through Belgium and France. The story of Dunkirk is often called a miracle, and in many ways, it was. But it was also a story of shame, of chaos, of heartbreak, and of choices that haunt the men who made them to this day. It is, above all, a story about what happens when ordinary people are caught in the machinery of war, and how some of them, against all odds, found a way out. On the 10th of May, 1940, Hitler's armies turned their attention to Western Europe. The Germans, using every means of attack at their disposal, had already crushed Poland, Norway, and Denmark. This was blitzkrieg, lightning war, fast, brutal, and overwhelming. Tanks, aircraft, and infantry working in terrifying coordination, smashing through defenses before they could be organized, and racing ahead before anyone could react. It was a new kind of warfare, and the Allies were utterly unprepared for it. Now it was the turn of France, Belgium, and Holland to feel the full might of the German forces, led by the fearsome panzer divisions and supported from the air by the Luftwaffe. On the very same day that the German offensive began, Winston Churchill succeeded Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister. Churchill and his new coalition government were immediately faced with an unhappy and serious state of affairs. 28 German divisions were sweeping through the Low Countries toward France and the northern coast. The speed of the advance was staggering. The Germans were attacking on three fronts. Holland surrendered on the 14th of May, while Army Group B struck Belgium, and believing this to be the main German thrust, 10 divisions of what was called the British Expeditionary Force, along with the French 1st and 7th Armies, were sent north to meet them. They received a tremendous reception from the Belgians, cheering crowds everywhere. Bob Pendleton's unit was on exercise near the Somme when the invasion began. On hearing the news, they immediately moved forward into Belgium. "We got a tremendous reception from the Belgians," he recalled, cheering crowds everywhere. "We were amazed that the Germans made no effort to try and stop us." He paused, because, of course, they were thinking that we should go up there. It was a trap, and the British walked straight into it. While the BEF and the best French forces were drawn north into Belgium, the real German hammer blow was falling far to the south. The Allied forces soon realized that to the south, the Germans were also thundering through France. The French had always assumed that the Ardennes, the thick, forested hills along the Belgian-Luxembourg border, were impenetrable for tanks, and so their reserve army was stationed there. It broke rapidly under the blitzkrieg. The assumption that had underpinned the entire Allied defensive strategy was, in the space of days, proven fatally wrong. Georg Lehrmann and his regiment were part of that unstoppable advance. "We marched over Belgium," he recalled, "the Albert Canal, to the English Channel. The Albert Canal had been taken by a parachute unit jumping out from gliders, so we were able to march through without a problem." For the German soldiers, those early days must have felt like the war was already won. Bob Pendleton's unit moved up to the River Dyle, the first natural obstacle in front of the advancing Germans. There, they demolished bridges in the hope of slowing the onslaught, but the Allied armies were unable to halt the rapid German advance. By the 21st of May, the French and British forces had been completely separated, split in two by the speed and effectiveness of blitzkrieg. The situation was deteriorating by the hour. "We were told, to our amazement and bewilderment, that we were going to withdraw," Bob recalled. The French had apparently given way on our right flank. The Germans had broken through at Sedan and the Ardennes, and were racing towards the Channel ports. Our right flank was exposed. He took a breath. So off we set backwards. And that was the start of the withdrawal, which was to last a fortnight and take us to the beaches of Dunkirk. There was now the very real likelihood of a Belgian surrender, and the British were faced with the terrifying prospect of losing their access to the Channel ports, the lifeline of the British forces. Supplies were running low. There was little to be done. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, General Lord Gort, requested that the War Office make plans to evacuate his army from France. Gort selected Dunkirk as the place from which to rescue the British forces. The task of organizing the evacuation in Britain was given to Vice Admiral Bertram Ramsay, the commander at Dover. It was codenamed Operation Dynamo. With that decision, the fate of an army, and perhaps of the war itself, would come down to a stretch of beach and whatever ships could be found to cross the Channel. But the men being asked to fight their way to that beach were in no shape for a grand campaign. Bob Pendleton's own experience told the story of Britain's unpreparedness in miniature. "When I came over here originally," he said, shaking his head at the memory, "I was issued with 12 bullets. 12. 4.5 bullets. I didn't have a gun, just the 12 bullets, and a motorcycle." He let that sink in. One Bren gun in a battalion, with nothing, and they were supposed to fight the Germans. Just impossible. This was the reality behind the official dispatches and the War Office communiques. An army sent to fight one of the most formidable military machines in history, equipped with almost nothing. The men knew it. Their officers knew it. And now, with the order to retreat, the only question was whether they could reach the coast before the Germans caught them. Ordered to retreat, the British troops began to fall back toward the coast. And as the soldiers withdrew, they found themselves sharing the roads with something that made the horror of war impossible to ignore: the refugees. Bob Pendleton had just met a girl called Simone in the Belgian town of Les Cans when the orders came through. The last time he saw her, she was with her mother and father, her father pulling a cart loaded with their belongings, joining the millions of civilians streaming away from the German advance. "I'll never forget that day," Bob said, his voice heavy even after 6 decades. "I thought afterwards, many times, that if I'd had my wits about me, she could have got dressed in soldier's clothes, and I could have taken her on the bike and got her across to England. But anyway, that's how it happened." It was a small, personal tragedy amid the vastness of the catastrophe. But it captures something essential about what Dunkirk meant to the people who lived through it, the haunting sense of what was lost, and the choices that could never be undone. The withdrawal itself was a nightmare. Night after night, the same grim routine. "We would withdraw during the night," Bob explained, "about an hour after everybody else had already left. So it was a very lonely business, waiting for an hour to elapse before you went withdrawing yourself, and then withdrawing through the darkness, terrified of losing your way. Arriving at a new position behind another river, digging in the early hours of the morning, and during part of the day, waiting for a German onslaught, and then doing exactly the same the following night. Every foot, every yard of ground was contested. The casualties among soldiers and civilians alike began to mount. The Stukas, the German dive bombers with their terrifying wailing sirens, came again and again. And their targets were not only soldiers. There was a great deal of bombing at this time, Bob recalled. Stuka dive bombing, but principally on the roads, against the refugees, which was a horrible sight. The bombs would come down, and they would run in all directions, and very often they would get hit, so that you would have women and children lying dead in the roadway, amidst all their belongings, over the very road which you had got to drive your trucks. And so you did your best to avoid running over everything, but it was just constant, all the way back to Dunkirk. The convoys were hit too, horses and men killed together in the same blasts, and all along the line of retreat, the evidence of an army in desperate flight. Georg Lehrmann saw it from the other side. The lorries, the guns, they weren't just left standing, he said. They had been tipped over, and from that you could tell that the men who had used them had needed to get away quickly. They'd been driven into ditches and tipped over. For one British soldier, the chaos of the retreat brought a moment he would never forget. He came upon a house full of wounded men, with a single soldier at the door. "Is there anything you can do for me?" the soldier asked. "I've got all these men in here. They're all wounded. I have no means of getting them away. I just don't know what to do about them." There was nothing to be done. It was not a nice feeling, the soldier admitted. Meanwhile, General Lord Gort withdrew the British forces to a final defensive position along the canal line of the rivers Yser, Scarpe, and Aue. He had hoped that help would come from the towns of Boulogne and Calais, but Boulogne fell into German hands on the 24th of May, and Calais, despite an epic defensive action by the 1st Battalion of the Rifle Brigade, was captured 2 days later. The position looked hopeless. Every channel port south of Dunkirk was now in enemy hands. There was one way out, and one way only. We didn't know what was going on, Bob admitted. I suspect that nobody did. And we were a bit scared of these Stukas that kept dropping the odd bomb here and there. But nevertheless, this disillusionment and fear, I don't think, in any way prevented us from carrying out our normal soldierly duties. Not all the encounters on the retreat were with the enemy. At one point, Bob came across 6 French soldiers, their rifles in hand. They stopped him. "Anglais party," they said. "The English are leaving." Bob protested. "No, we're here." But the Frenchmen were insistent. "Party, Dunkirk," they said. Bob was baffled. "I'd never even heard of Dunkirk," he recalled. "That was the first I knew about the evacuation. This would have been about 10 days before we got there. 10 days. 10 days of fighting, retreating, and marching toward a destination that most of the men on the ground didn't even know existed as a plan. 2 of Bob's comrades had stayed behind to blow up an obstacle, and as the charges went off, they could hear German troops marching down the road toward them. The 2 men hid in a ditch and covered themselves while the German soldiers marched past close enough to touch, close enough to hear the rhythm of their boots on the cobblestones. And then something remarkable happened, something that, even now, historians struggle to fully explain. This was a critical point in the evacuation. The unrelenting German attacks could have destroyed the Allied forces caught in northern France. The British had a powerful, seemingly unstoppable enemy in front of them, and the North Sea at their back. In Britain, there were dark predictions that perhaps only 50,000 men from the entire army could be saved. With more than 4 times that number of British troops in France, it did not look good. But Hitler made a key decision that helped the Allies in their retreat to Dunkirk. Because he needed to conquer the rest of France, Hitler wanted to rest his armies. On the 24th of May, he ordered a temporary halt to the Fourth Army's advance. They were to take 2 days to rest and resupply. It was a decision that has been debated ever since, and it gave the Allies a crucial breathing space. There was another factor behind the halt. Hermann Goering had assured the Führer that his Luftwaffe could destroy the Allied troops in the Dunkirk pocket on their own, from the air alone. It was a boast that would prove hollow, but at the time, Hitler believed it. Georg Lehrmann's regiment had been part of the relentless advance. "First of all, we saw the Stukas and the explosions from our artillery," he recalled. "But it didn't last long. It lasted about 2 hours. And then we had to stop firing, and I was given the order to drive into France. The halt had come, and with it, the slenderest of chances for the men in the pocket. Georg Lehrmann witnessed firsthand what the halt looked like from the German side. With the lull in fighting, the thoughts of some soldiers turned to darker impulses. In a town near the front, the consequences of indiscipline were made brutally clear. "We had a break for 4 hours one night," Georg recalled, "and in the morning we had to line up. One of our soldiers had forcibly raped a girl at gunpoint. We all gathered together at the town hall marketplace, and he was executed the same day. A measure to ensure that all soldiers knew what was going on, that during the war, such acts would be punished by death." During the unexpected respite, there were other crucial developments that helped the Allied cause. Captured German orders revealed a plan to attack in an area between Ypres and Menin, and General Gort was able to send reinforcements, thwarting a breakthrough that could have spelled disaster for the entire evacuation. And back in Britain, experts began to unlock the secrets of the captured Enigma coding machine, meaning that as the Germans rested, Gort was able to receive their decrypted messages. All of this helped ease some of the pressure on the Allies. But the men on the ground knew nothing of Enigma, nothing of high strategy, nothing of Hitler's hesitation. They only knew exhaustion. They knew the sound of Stukas. They knew the smell of burning oil and the taste of dust in their mouths. And they knew that every mile they marched brought them closer to either salvation or capture. "We were beginning to get really very tired," Bob said. "At the age of 18, 19, 20, you haven't got the stamina that you get later. And very difficult to keep awake." He recalled one night during the withdrawal when the entire column ground to a halt. He climbed out of his truck and walked forward to find his platoon sergeant and driver fast asleep in the cab. The war could wait, their bodies could not. By the time hostilities were fully resumed on the 27th of May, the Allied defensive positions around Dunkirk had been organized, and the first troops had already begun to sail for home. It was not before time. On that same day, Belgium formally surrendered. The ring was closing. Inside the defensive ring was a mass of seething humanity. 360,000 British, French, and Belgian troops, alongside more than 250,000 civilians, were packed into an area totaling less than 100 square miles. Military transports, trucks, tanks, and lorries lined the lanes and streets in their thousands. The air smelled of cordite and burning fuel. The constant crump of artillery merged with the scream of dive bombers overhead into a continuous wall of noise that seemed to vibrate in the chest. Bob Pendleton would never forget his first sight of it. It was like a vehicle scrapyard, he said. There were disabled vehicles lying on either side of the road, with barely room for people to get through. And it must be borne in mind that all this time, and with all this movement, we were hampered by the refugee columns streaming away from the Germans. Georg Lehrmann and his comrades saw the same chaos from the advancing German side. We saw the Stukas fly in, he recalled, and that the men had left everything lying around. We saw all the vehicles and the trains. Everything had been abandoned, so the men must have run away. We saw it all. The officers, he said, probably knew as little as the ordinary soldiers. But we were sent in. We were told we had to prevent the English departure. With the pocket gradually being reduced by German pressure, Bob was given a dangerous mission. He was ordered to go to Berghez, a town 10 miles from Dunkirk, to deliver a message telling the troops there to fall back. I came in over the bridge, over the grass verge, parked the bike, Bob recalled, his eyes distant with the memory. Looked around. Everything was on fire. It was devastating. Absolute chaos. Nothing moving. The whole town blazing. I had to get towels wrapped around my head. I used the canal to dampen the towels and wrap them around so I wasn't affected by it. I had to walk from the motorcycle to the town hall, get down to the cellars, get these men out, inform them that they had to get to Dunkirk the only way they could walking. And yet, even with the Allies in such disarray, the Germans seemed somehow to hold back. Why they didn't attack all parts of the Allied defenses more vigorously is a mystery that has endured for more than 6 decades. There is even one outlandish theory that to secure a swift peace agreement with the British, Hitler deliberately allowed them to make their dramatic escape. Whether that theory holds water or not, the fact remains. The Germans made rapid inroads to the south, but strangely, in the center and to the north, they hardly advanced at all. As the men moved toward Dunkirk, they navigated by 2 things. We knew where it was for 2 reasons, one soldier recalled. We could see the pall of smoke emanating from the burning oil refinery. And also, quite honestly, you could just follow the Stukas all the way to Dunkirk, follow the bombers to safety. There was a grim logic to it. I felt they were about 8 or 9 miles away, Bob said. I thought they'd just come through and capture us and take us because we had nothing to defend ourselves with. It was just a matter of waiting for them to appear. He paused, and the silence of the memory settled over him. But they never appeared. To this day, I cannot explain it. We had nothing, no guns, no ammunition, no hope of reinforcement. They could have walked through us like a knife through butter, but they never came. Not everyone was so fortunate. One of my best friends, who I joined the army with, got killed holding the bridgehead while we evacuated, Bob said quietly. So not everyone got away from Dunkirk. From the 26th of May, the great rescue of the Allied forces at Dunkirk began. While British and French troops fought to defend the town itself, a remarkable fleet of ships had arrived off the French coast to ferry the besieged troops back to Britain. The British Admiralty had realized early on that to evacuate more than 200,000 troops from Dunkirk, it would need a far larger fleet than was currently available. And so a desperate appeal went out to all owners of small boats to come to the aid of the Royal Navy. This flotilla of little ships made Dunkirk the stuff of legend. Every conceivable type of sailing craft, yachts, fishing boats, pleasure boats, steam packets, and barges turned up on the south coast or in the Thames estuary to help with the evacuation. The fleet included more than 40 British, French, Belgian, and Dutch warships of all types, destroyers, minesweepers, sloops, personnel ships, all come to aid their allies in their desperate hour of need. And of course, there were the famous little ships, more than 900 of them, in all shapes and sizes. But for the little ships, this was certainly no pleasure cruise. From the skies above came the German dive bombers and machine gun fire. From the shore came the shells of the German artillery. Georg Lehrmann was in one of those artillery regiments, and he had been ordered to prevent the Allied evacuation. What he saw, what he was ordered to do, haunts him still. "I'll be honest," Georg said, and his voice cracked even after all those years. "I cried when they said that we should fire into the men. You can't do that. They had no weapons, nothing at all, and we were able to fire with artillery. We had rifles. The infantry was there as well. They had no means of defense. They had thrown away their weapons. They weren't running around defending themselves. They were on the beach, trying to reach the boats." Those words carry a weight that no military history can quite convey. A young German soldier, weeping at the orders he had been given, firing on men who could not fire back. It is one of the most honest and devastating testimonies to come out of Dunkirk from either side. The whole episode, Georg would say later, filled him even today with great shame. "I hate it," he said simply. "This place was absolutely full of bodies, men lying about, some walking into the sea. Our guns were trained on the fleeing people who couldn't defend themselves anymore, and we fired on them like crazy." He paused, searching for words. "I've no idea why. And what of the men on the receiving end of that fire? What was it like to stand on a beach with no weapon, no cover, and no certainty that you would ever leave?" Remarkably, the veterans recall not panic, but a strange numbness. "We didn't see panic," one soldier said. "Panic didn't exist. Everybody was too frightened to panic, I think. Too frightened to panic." It is a phrase that captures the peculiar psychology of extreme danger, the point at which fear becomes so total that it circles back around to a kind of frozen calm. On the beaches, the scene was barely controlled chaos. "You came eventually in sight of the sea," Bob recalled, "and there was this great pall of smoke to our left, which was Dunkirk, the oil tanks blazing. And then in front, there were great lines of soldiers, up to their waists, their necks, stretching into the sea. There were queues and queues of men waiting to embark. The area was being bombed constantly." Bob and his companions moved about 500 yards down the beach, dug into the sand dunes, and waited. "The first thing we all wanted was some sleep," he said. "So we got into the sand dunes and we went to sleep. And people often say to me, how awful the dive bombing must have been. We slept through it. I think we must have slept for about 24 hours. We were so tired. 24 hours, asleep on a beach under German bombardment. That single detail tells you more about the state of those men than any casualty report ever could. The footage that survives from those days, and the photographs taken by those who were there, show scenes that are at once chaotic and eerily orderly. Long lines of men standing in the surf, waiting their turn. Boats capsized in the shallows, columns of black smoke rising from the burning port behind them, and everywhere, the detritus of an army in retreat, rifles stacked on the sand, helmets floating in the waves, vehicles driven into the sea as makeshift jetties. Meanwhile, Georg watched from the dunes on the German side. "We stood up here and watched the men trying to get away in the boats," he said, "and it was difficult. They couldn't land properly. They had to go into the water and then into the boats, and that took time. The Stukas arrived in waves. The same ones flew over repeatedly," Georg recalled. "All we heard was the wailing siren. It dived and boomed. For the men on the beach with no cover and no weapons, each attack was an exercise in pure terror. And yet there were also moments of dark, absurd comedy amid the carnage." One soldier waiting on the beach remembered the scene. "I remember coming across a French soldier who had obviously just been in a bombing raid. He had one eyeball hanging down his cheek, and he was screaming for help, and I was not much good at coping with a situation like that. Even those who made it onto the ships were not safe. Some soldiers who thought they had reached safety soon found it was a case of out of the frying pan, into the fire. A couple of destroyers came ashore," one veteran recalled, "and we joined the queue of men embarking. However, we chose the wrong one. Hardly had we set sail when it was hit, a direct hit from an aircraft. The entire forecastle was blown out. We were fortunately on the deck, and many men were wounded. However, another destroyer, HMS Malcolm, came alongside, and we were able to throw the wounded across. Eventually, we scrambled across ourselves, and we set sail. The most successful day of the evacuation was the 30th of May, when 53,000 men were ferried back to Britain. Many small ships made the journey across the channel several times, back and forth through the bombardment. The sailors of those privately owned volunteer craft put their lives on the line. By the time the evacuation officially ended on the 4th of June, Nearly 250 of the small craft had been destroyed, almost a third of those that had taken part. The human cost was written in the faces of the men who waited, faces blackened with smoke and oil, eyes hollow with exhaustion, uniforms soaked through from hours standing in the surf. Georg saw what was happening and felt something unexpected, not triumph, but futility. All they wanted was to get away, he said. Get away from the beaches and get over to England. That was the main thing. There were so many men. It was just impossible to move without them, loads of them, all over the place. And then, with the quiet honesty that defined his testimony, everyone realized that it was senseless. The men at the guns didn't see it, but the infantrymen, they stopped, and I noticed that less and less guns were firing. In the midst of this desperate evacuation, the troops maintained an almost superhuman discipline, even though for some it was 3 days before they were able to leave the shore. One officer recalled meeting the adjutant of his battalion on the beach. "Good to see you," the adjutant said. "Right. Get your platoon off. Back to England now." The officer asked the obvious question, "How do I do that?" The adjutant's reply was magnificently unhelpful. "Use your initiative." But before Bob Pendleton could leave the Dunkirk beaches, his brigadier gave him one last message to deliver, this time to the British troops still holding the defensive line. It was time for them to leave and get to the beaches. Bob rode his motorcycle up to a farm where the troops were supposed to be. There was no sign of anyone except the farmer and his family. He went back and reported, "They're not there," he told the brigadier. The reply came, "Well, they must have retired. Try again." So Bob went back. He turned right at the junction, and there, 50 yards away, was the advance guard of the German SS, machine guns, armored cars, everything. "I didn't take any more to do," Bob said. "I turned that bike down very, very quickly and made sure they weren't following me." He got back to the brigadier. "Well, I know they're not there now," he reported. "Why?" "Because the Germans are there." The brigadier nodded. "We can now go to Dunkirk." And then there is the story of the Padre, one of those moments that, even amid the horror, reminds you that war is also a profoundly human experience, full of absurdity and dark comedy. A group of soldiers had set off in a small boat, rowing toward a destroyer they could see silhouetted against the night sky. They were about 400 yards away when they heard the anchor chain coming up. The destroyer was turning. It was leaving without them. A padre who was sitting in the middle of the boat leaped to his feet, flung his arms wide to the heavens and shouted, "Lord, Lord, why hast thou forsaken us?" And 40 soldiers as one voice shouted, "Sit down," because as he leaped to his feet, the boat rocked violently. Water came sloshing over the sides, and that great shout echoed across the water to the destroyer. It came to a stop. Whether it was God or 40 angry soldiers, something had been heard. By nightfall on the 1st of June, real and spectacular progress had been made. Only 3 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force remained ashore. By the following day, they had all been evacuated. The defenses around the town were being manned only by French troops, who fought doggedly on against the great tide of the German army. It was only a matter of time before they were engulfed completely. Their sacrifice, holding the line while the last British soldiers were taken off, deserves to be remembered alongside the little ships and the beaches. Without the French rearguard, thousands more men would have been lost. On the 3rd and 4th of June, British ships returned to rescue as many as possible. Bob Pendleton was among the very last to leave. His escape was worthy of a film. The pier had been blown apart, a 10-foot gap where the structure had been destroyed. Soldiers had bridged it with planks they had found. Bob rode his motorcycle across the makeshift bridge, then let the bike go into the sea. "I tried to climb down the pier," he said. "These broad beams, very slippery. I did about 5 trips on a motorcycle, and then I slipped about halfway down and I fell. And the fishermen caught me into the boat." He paused. "And that's how we got away." Some French fishing trawlers were the only vessels that could still get in the pier. It was full of blazing ships. It was chaos to the very end. Inevitably, Dunkirk fell, and the final troops were evacuated on the 4th of June. Even so, some 40,000 Frenchmen were left behind, men who had fought bravely to hold the perimeter, who had expected to be evacuated alongside their British allies, and who now faced years of captivity. Their abandonment would poison Anglo-French relations for years to come. But Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk, had been a success beyond anyone's darkest expectations in late May. The initial prediction had been that perhaps 50,000 men could be saved. In the end, it was incredible that 338,226 Allied troops had been borne to safety across the Channel. 139,000 of these were French and Belgian soldiers. It was, by any measure, an astonishing achievement, a logistical miracle conjured from chaos by the courage of ordinary sailors and the stubbornness of soldiers who refused to die. The men came home to England, and the first thing many of them remember is not the relief, not the joy, but a cup of tea and a jam sandwich. "We felt thoroughly demoralized and awful," one soldier admitted. "We'd run away. Our fathers had fought for 4 long years in France and had never given way, and we'd been in action for a fortnight. We had hardly seen any real fighting. The shame was real, and it was deep." These men knew the truth of what had happened, even as the newspapers were calling it a miracle. And then came the speech that changed how many of them felt. The men were marched to a gymnasium and told to sit on the floor. There was a gallery overlooking them, and out onto it strode a full colonel with a red cap. "Welcome home, heroes of the BEF," he declared. And the men thought, heroes? They looked at each other dirty, thin, ashamed, and the words seemed to belong to a different army entirely. But the colonel went on, at some length, about what a wonderful show they had put up against overwhelming odds. He spoke of courage and duty and sacrifice, and by the end of it, the veteran recalled, we really felt very much better, so that, in fact, when we eventually got home on leave, we were greeted everywhere as heroes. He paused, but I knew, in my heart of hearts, we weren't heroes at all. No matter how the returning troops felt, there was understandable joy and relief throughout Great Britain that so many had escaped. But harsh reality soon tempered the euphoria. The country was now at the mercy of the Germans. Although Britain's army had been delivered virtually intact, almost all of its equipment was still in France, in the hands of the enemy. The numbers were devastating. All tanks and transport had been lost. 2,500 guns, 70,000 vehicles, 500,000 tons of ammunition, all of it left in the wreckage of Dunkirk. If the Germans had launched an invasion of Britain in those weeks, the island would have had almost nothing with which to defend itself. The soldiers were home, but the tools of war were scattered across the fields and roads of northern France. Dunkirk had been a victory to boost morale, but little else. The saga also did little for Anglo-French relations. The Vichy government that was soon established in France coined the phrase perfidious Albion, accusing Britain of abandoning its allies in an all-out attempt to save its own army. Many think this an unfounded slur that denigrated the heroic efforts of the evacuation fleet and insulted the memory of those who had given their lives. Winston Churchill attempted to calm Britain's euphoric mood. "Wars are not won by evacuations," warned the new Prime Minister, as he tried to prepare the country for the dark days ahead. He was right, of course. The months that followed would bring the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, and the long, grinding years of a war that was far from over. But Churchill also understood something else that Dunkirk had given the nation, something it desperately needed. Not a victory, but a story. A story of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. A story of survival against the odds. A story that, true or not in all its details, would sustain a country through its darkest hours. For the men who had been there, the story was more complicated. They knew the chaos, the fear, the shame of retreat. They knew about the friends who didn't make it back. They knew about the 40,000 Frenchmen left behind. They knew that Dunkirk was not a victory, it was the narrowest of escapes from total catastrophe. But they also knew something else. They knew what it felt like to be standing on a beach at the edge of the world, with nothing between them and oblivion but a stretch of gray water and the courage of the men who sailed across it to bring them home. The events at Dunkirk were truly extraordinary, and those who lived through them have never forgotten. "Frightening but uplifting," one veteran said. "Uplifting because of the spirit of the people on the beaches," another recalled. Everyone talked about the miracle of Dunkirk, and it seemed to be a miracle that so many of us got off. It was a miracle the water was so calm that the weather was good, and that the Germans didn't try to launch their final killer blow, which they could have done so easily. Georg Lehrmann, standing on the beaches where he once fired on defenseless men, spoke carefully. "This is the first time I've been back," he said. "And for me there are, of course, good and bad memories. I look at it like this. The war was not necessary. We didn't know why the war took place." Bob Pendleton, walking beside the man who had once been his enemy, reflected on what Dunkirk had meant. "I looked on it as though we'd been defeated in France," he said, "which we were. And then afterwards, as the war went on, You realized that you were going to win eventually. That was a great feeling. The war went on, of course. After Dunkirk came the battles that shaped the future of the world. Normandy, El Alamein, Monte Cassino, the Ardennes. Men who had been implacable enemies would one day meet at the scenes of those epic struggles. But Dunkirk was where it began for the British, at least. It was their first great test, and they had failed it in every military sense. And yet from that failure had come something extraordinary, a story of rescue and resilience that became the foundation of everything that followed. Two old men on a beach, one English, one German. More than 60 years since they stood on opposite sides of a catastrophe, walking together now, in the quiet of a French afternoon, sharing memories that most people can barely imagine. 338,226 men were saved at Dunkirk. But Dunkirk was never just about the numbers. It was about the men who queued in the water for hours, under fire, waiting for boats that might never come. It was about the sailors who crossed and recrossed the channel through bombs and shells. It was about a German artilleryman who wept at the orders he was given. It was about a signalman who lost a girl called Simone and never forgot her. It was about soldiers who slept for 24 hours under dive bombers because their bodies simply gave out. It was about a padre who stood up in a boat and nearly capsized it, and 40 men who shouted him down, and a destroyer that stopped. It was about a motorcycle ridden across a broken pier and dropped into the sea. It was about a jam sandwich at Ramsgate that tasted like the finest meal a man had ever eaten. Dunkirk was a defeat. It was a miracle. It was a disgrace. It was a triumph. It was all of these things at once, and it was the moment when Britain looked total disaster in the face and somehow, improbably, impossibly, got away. The men who lived through it carried the memory for the rest of their lives, not as heroes, not as victims, but as witnesses to something that should never have happened and as proof that even in the darkest hour, the human will to survive can find a way. Because that is the truth of Dunkirk. It was not glorious, it was not clean, but it was real. And in its desperate, chaotic, heartbreaking reality, it became something that no one had planned, and no one expected, a story that an entire nation would cling to in the years of darkness that followed. A story of a signalman on a motorcycle, riding through burning towns to deliver messages that might already be too late. A story of a German artilleryman who wept at his own orders. A story of fishermen and yachtsmen who sailed into hell and brought an army home. And perhaps that is the real miracle. Not that the army was saved, but that in the saving of it, something else was preserved, something harder to define, but just as vital. A belief that even when everything has gone wrong, when the enemy is at the gates and the sea is at your back, there is still a reason to keep going. There is still a reason to hope. The beaches of Dunkirk are quiet now. The tide comes in and goes out, as it always has. The sand that once ran red has been washed clean 1,000,000 times over. The piers have been rebuilt, the buildings restored, the scars of war smoothed away by time and the patient work of reconstruction. Tourists come in summer. Children build sandcastles. It is a place of peace. But if you listen carefully, in the wind off the channel, you can almost hear them, the voices of the men who were here. The shouts, the prayers, the silence after the guns. The roar of engines and the crash of waves against the hulls of small boats. The crackle of burning oil and the distant thud of artillery. They echo still, because some places remember, even when the world forgets. And Dunkirk, this quiet, ordinary beach town on the northern coast of France, will remember forever. The afternoon of May the 10th, 1940. The old house on Downing Street stood quiet in the spring light, but inside, the machinery of empire was turning on its axis. Neville Chamberlain, the man who had promised peace in our time, had at last proven himself as ineffectual in war as he had been in peace. The pressure for his resignation was irresistible. The people burned for leadership, for inspiration. And so, on that fateful afternoon, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, 65 years old, a man who had spent 23 years in the political wilderness, derided by many as a relic of a bygone age, received the seals of highest office. Years later, Churchill would recall that moment with characteristic grandeur. "I felt that I was walking with destiny," he wrote, "and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." For early that day, before Churchill had even unpacked his bags, Germany had invaded the Low Countries. In the roar of the advancing panzers, there sounded one clear signal: the phony war was over. Adolf Hitler had at last turned westwards, determined on a knockout offensive that would ensure Nazi domination of the continent of Europe forever. we need to go back. Back to the death of aged President Hindenburg, when the last remaining constitutional hindrance on Hitler's path to absolute power was removed. The once lowly ex-corporal and failed artist became effectively dictator of Germany, and could now set about molding his country to the great destiny he believed her rightful due. Churchill had seen the danger long before most. While others slept, he sounded the alarm with a prescience that now reads as prophecy. "I dread the day," he warned, "when the means of threatening the heart of the British Empire should pass into the hands of the present rulers of Germany." He predicted, with chilling accuracy, that Hitler's government would confront Europe with a series of outrageous events and ever-growing military might. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The government, Churchill lamented, could not make up their minds or could not get the Prime Minister to make up his mind. And so they went on, he said, in a strange paradox. Decided only to be undecided, resolved to be irresolute, adamant for drift, solid for fluidity, all-powerful to be impotent. And so the drift continued, until it could continue no more. By September the 3rd, 1939, the war so long avoided, so unavailingly postponed, had finally come to pass. That Sunday, Churchill told Parliament words that carried the weight of a man who had spent years preparing for precisely this reckoning. Outside, the storms of war may blow and the lands may be lashed with the fury of its gales, but in our own hearts this Sunday morning, there is peace. Our hands may be active, but our consciences are at rest. No longer could Churchill be kept from office. After 23 years in the wilderness, he returned to the Admiralty. But the war's opening months brought no glory. Poland was destroyed. Hitler remained ominously quiescent. What was called the phony war supervened, as British troops embarked for France with defense, rather than attack, at the forefront of Allied thinking. One dismal attempt only was made to seize the initiative, the wretchedly mismanaged Narvik expedition, which ended in humiliation. Chamberlain had proven himself wanting, and when the call came at last for a leader equal to the hour, there was only one man who could answer it. Churchill had barely taken office when the catastrophe began. The threat of a German onslaught through Western Europe had been long foreseen, and France had built up an army widely considered to be the best in Europe, reinforced now by 10 divisions of the British Expeditionary Force. The defenses were thought to be formidable. They were nothing of the kind. Belgium was quickly overrun. On May the 14th, the Dutch negotiated a surrender. That same day, Churchill received horrifying news from France, news that would haunt the Allied command for weeks to come. A huge German concentration of armor had passed through the Ardennes, previously thought impassable, ripping open a 50-mile breach in the center of the French defenses. Guderian's panzers were racing to the sea. The German generals were both moving and thinking faster than their Allied opponents. A small British counterattack at Arras could not be followed up. The rout accelerated. The British commander, Lord Gort, fell back to the Channel coast, as the Germans, taken aback by their own astonishing success, paused to consolidate. And in that pause, that brief, improbable hesitation, the miracle of Dunkirk began. From the English coast, innumerable boats of every size and description streamed out across the Channel. Fishing trawlers, pleasure yachts, lifeboats, ferries, a ragged armada summoned by desperation and held together by courage. The troops waited in long, patient queues on the open beaches, dive-bombed and strafed, wading out into the surf to clamber aboard anything that floated. By early June, they had managed to evacuate 340,000 Allied troops, far more than Churchill or anyone else had dared anticipate. It was a miracle, but a miracle born of catastrophe, and Churchill knew it. It was a deliverance, but Churchill was careful not to dress it as a triumph. Dunkirk, though glorious, was scarcely a victory, and what followed was worse. On the 24th of June, the French government made a shameful peace. Britain was left the last European citadel against Nazism, the final haven for the dispossessed and brave of many nations. To all in London that bright summer of 1940, the future was one of fraught uncertainty. Britain's nearest ally was gone. The United States, still only a cool friend, was an ocean away. Against this, within 9 months, the Germans had brought off a series of dazzling victories. Hitler was master of Europe, absolute ruler of a dozen nations. His allies were formidable. Stalin's huge Soviet Union, fiercely militaristic Japan, fascist Italy with her modern navy. For Western European civilization, the black abyss beckoned. Only Britain held out. Although she retained her fleet and her vast empire, Neither could help in repelling the murderous onslaught already in preparation Goering's terrible airborne battalions. Britain's army was small and badly equipped. Her air force was inadequate to the task at hand. Her chances were rated low. It was commonly estimated that, alone against Germany, Britain could last no more than 3 months. And with the extraordinary success everywhere of German arms, the Wehrmacht had acquired a weapon yet more potent than their all-conquering panzers, a psychological weapon. For the conviction was spreading that the Germans were indeed invincible, that winged victory fluttered always amongst the eagles and swastikas. Hitler could not be beaten. Hope itself was a cheat and a delusion. Nor were there lacking, in Whitehall or in Westminster, those all too willing to share such beliefs who eagerly and cravenly sought to yield on any terms, accept any conditions, embrace any humiliation, merely to be allowed to survive. Hitler's power seemed unassailable, and to the numbed and prostrate peoples of continental Europe, the thousand-year Reich appeared a grim and present reality. It was at this moment, this lowest ebb, that the surprised dictator of Nazi Germany was confronted, for the first time, by an adversary unshakably determined on resistance to the uttermost. Above the tumult of wars and armies, there rang out over Europe a voice marvelous in defiance, ardent in the courage never to submit or yield, a voice full of resolution and faith in victory. "We shall go on to the end," Churchill thundered before Parliament. "We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." His masterful oratory thrilled and inspired wherever it was heard. In sullen, fear-laden camps across the huge, bleak expanse of Nazi-occupied Europe, prisoners, often with no other language in common, would exchange in greeting a single whispered word: Churchill. For them, he was the hope beyond despair, and he gave that hope a creed to live by. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat," he told the House. "You ask, what is our policy? I will say, it is to wage war, by sea, land, and air, with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be." Following the armistice at Compiègne, the French Atlantic ports became naval bases for the Germans, who also acquired new and more westerly airfields. The ranges of both their U-boats and aircraft were thereby enhanced. For Churchill's new coalition war cabinet, an immediate concern was the strong French fleet, still intact and in theory controlled by the puppet Vichy government. Were those ships to fall into German hands, the German navy would be much strengthened. The danger was grave. Admiral Darlan refused to commit his ships to Britain. Although the French had so recently been comrades in arms, Churchill could not hesitate. He ordered the Royal Navy to destroy the main French squadron at Mers el-Kebir. "It was," he said, "a hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful with which I have ever been associated, but it was made." For the first time, Churchill drew unrestrained cheers from the conservative benches. Meanwhile, 50 miles north of London, a remarkable secret was being guarded at a rambling Victorian estate called Bletchley Park. Here was assembled the cream of the British mathematical and scientific elite, and throughout the war, they would provide Churchill with one supremely valuable asset: accurate, immediate intelligence. The German military had refined a highly sophisticated encryption machine called Enigma, whose revolving drums could generate literally trillions of combinations. The Germans had every reason to believe that Enigma was impossible to break. Bletchley achieved the impossible. Enigma machines were successfully replicated. Then, with the help of an early computing device known as the bomb, the military codes were broken one by one. The information yielded was given a unique classification, Ultra. It was not long before what Churchill called his most secret source showed its value. From June of 1940 onward, there emerged a steady flow of information on the preparations for the invasion of Britain itself. On the 1st of August, A Göring signal was intercepted. The Luftwaffe was to prepare to eliminate the Royal Air Force with all the means at its disposal as rapidly as possible. Within a fortnight, the Battle of Britain had begun. Against the Luftwaffe's 2,800 fighters and bombers were pitted only 650 Spitfires and Hurricanes. But besides Ultra, Air Marshal Dowding had another incalculable advantage: Robert Watson Watt's radar systems. Dowding knew that if the Luftwaffe gained absolute air superiority, no navy in the world could stop the invasion barges crossing the channel. He conserved his resources with the utmost economy, whilst continuing to meet every raid. After a month, Göring, not knowing how near he had come to crippling fighter command, changed targets. The battered aerodromes and radar stations were granted a merciful respite. Instead, it became the turn of the cities, and before all others, London. Not long before, Churchill had warned and exhorted in words that captured the existential nature of what was at stake. The whole fury and might of the enemy must very soon be turned on us. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island, or lose the war. If we can stand up to him, all Europe may be free, and the life of the world may move forward into broad, sunlit uplands. But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, including all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age. Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duties, and so bear ourselves, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour. The footage that survives from those nights of the Blitz is haunting London's skyline lit orange by 1,000 fires. But the Luftwaffe had, in fact, been designed for army support, not strategic bombing. And although tens of thousands were left dead and millions of homes wrecked, the damage was much less than forecast. Morale, production, and communications went largely unaffected. From mid-September, Churchill knew, although he could not reveal how, that the invasion was off. His gratitude to the fighter pilots who had saved Britain was expressed in words that have passed into the language itself. Never in the field of human conflict, he declared, was so much owed by so many to so few. And if London burned, the lapping fires touched another flame, one that gleamed ever more brightly across the Atlantic. The hardline isolationists in America were still preponderant, and although both presidential candidates were pledged to keeping the boys back home, American public opinion was beginning to accept that Hitler should be fought. Meanwhile, another unrelenting and no less critical contest was being played out far away on the broad Atlantic. In 1940, the U-boat fleet, while still small, was achieving frightening success against the merchant navy. Escorts were too few. The fiercely neutral Irish Republic would not allow British warships to use her ports. Churchill was anxiously aware of just how dangerous was the hemorrhage in the vital Atlantic supply lines. By October, when he replaced the commander of the home fleet, 2 million tons of shipping had been lost. Admiral Dönitz was perfecting the open ocean Wolfpack system. Fortunately, bad winter weather brought some temporary relief. More than ever, Churchill needed to cajole the United States into the war. That autumn, a significant first step was taken when Roosevelt agreed to trade 50 old and near-useless destroyers for a ring of valuable British bases. The bargain in itself was so poor that Churchill tried to keep the details quiet, but as a token of American commitment, he said, "The destroyers are worth their weight in rubies." Meetings with Roosevelt continued, warm and frequent. Nevertheless, Churchill may have sometimes misunderstood where the enigmatic president's priorities lay. Roosevelt had severe internal problems, and the greater good of the United States was or had to be his first consideration. America would gladly become the arsenal of democracy, but the enterprise would be run on strictly commercial principles. As 1940 drew to a close, Churchill dared not make public his most burdensome anxiety. Britain's lonely struggle was driving her rapidly into bankruptcy. A bill to allow Britain to borrow to finance the war was before Congress. Churchill issued a moving appeal: "Put your confidence in us. Give us your faith and your blessing, and under Providence all will be well. We shall not fail or falter. We shall not weaken or tire. Neither the sudden shock of battle nor the long-drawn trials of vigilance and exertion will wear us down. Give us the tools, and we will finish the job." But before Lend-Lease, there came cash and carry. The Americans wanted, first, all of Britain's own gold reserves, then any gold that could be got from allies or the Dominions. All overseas assets, private or public, had to be sold off, often at knockdown prices. Large profits were made on Wall Street. The British-owned Viscose Company, after liquidation, realized $87 million it had been worth around 40 million more. The Americans also wanted into Britain's export markets. Imperial preference was abolished, and in the wider interests of furthering the war effort, Churchill sent over a high-level mission empowered to pass on to the delighted Americans the finest fruits of British scientific and industrial research. Details of the newest discoveries in anti-aircraft technology, explosives, rocketry, electronics, and the jet engine. There was a prototype of the cavity magnetron, which, by vastly increasing the power of radar, allowed it to be carried in aircraft for the first time. All these were goodwill gifts. In the Mediterranean, meanwhile, the war was offering both hope and heartbreak. With invasion still a real possibility, Churchill had taken the bold step of sending 150 tanks to General Wavell in Egypt, an act of strategic daring, for those tanks were desperately needed at home. Thereafter, military involvement in the Mediterranean increased steadily, partly because there was no other opportunity for fighting the Axis powers on land. Gradually, too, Churchill became fascinated with a thrust north through what he called the soft underbelly of Europe, a fascination that would shape Allied strategy for years to come. Not always for the better. In September of 1940, Mussolini, who already had one large army in Abyssinia and another advancing hesitantly into Egypt, embarked on an ill-conceived invasion of Greece. But it was at sea he sustained his first rebuff. The Italian Navy, albeit of uncertain prowess, possessed some of the most modern warships afloat. Half of them were destroyed at Taranto in an imaginatively daring attack launched from Admiral Cunningham's only aircraft carrier, a raid that, half a world away, was studied with keen interest by the Japanese. Churchill got on poorly with the laconic Wavell, whom he considered unfairly to be lacking in fighting spirit. Yet it was Wavell's finest commander, General O'Connor, who delivered the victories for which Churchill craved. A brilliant two-month campaign took O'Connor from Egypt to Tobruk and on to El Agheila. By February of 1941, his two divisions had captured 130,000 prisoners for fewer than 500 dead. O'Connor was poised to clear the Axis out of North Africa entirely. The chance was lost. Churchill learned through Ultra that Hitler was coming to the aid of the Italians, whose Greek offensive was floundering. And not for the only time, Churchill allowed generous emotion to outweigh sounder instincts. Greece civilization's birthplace had a British guarantee. O'Connor's experienced troops were diverted to a woeful campaign in which landings and evacuations went on simultaneously. It was a Dunkirk without the glory. Meanwhile, fresh German detachments began arriving in Tripoli under a new commander, Erwin Rommel. O'Connor's gains melted away. Rommel besieged Tobruk. Even worse was the debacle of Crete, garrisoned by 40,000 Allied troops. Although British command of the sea was assured, air cover was negligible. After fearful slaughter, the island fell to a purely airborne assault. The disaster was less than it first appeared. German losses of aircraft and elite paratroopers had been too severe for the exercise ever to be repeated. But for Churchill, accurately forewarned of the attack through Ultra and sorely needing a triumph, Crete was a heavy blow. Although Churchill undoubtedly relished power, there were times as more bad news succeeded to worse that he could be deeply cast down and would brood for hours, alone and unapproachable, but never for long. He possessed extraordinary resilience. In the spring of 1941, there was all too much cause for gloom. The Luftwaffe was being transferred east, but not before two huge farewell raids on London. During the same month, U-boats sank a record number of Allied ships. Churchill had insisted on action against Rommel, but Wavell's resources had been hopelessly depleted, and when Operation Battleaxe finally got underway, it soon foundered. However unfairly, the scent of failure clung to Wavell, whom Churchill now replaced with Auchinleck. In the incomparably smaller North African theater, Auchinleck finally moved against the supply-starved Rommel in November, relieved Tobruk, and once more advanced into Libya. But yet again, a promising offensive was halted because troops were pulled out. Two of the divisions urgently recalled for the defense of their native land, Australia. The Desert War, it seemed, could never quite deliver the decisive blow. On the morning of June the 22nd, 1941, the world awoke to momentous and earth-shaking news. Hitler had attacked his erstwhile ally, the Soviet Union, throwing in 3 million men, the largest invasion force in human history, over hundreds of miles of frontier, in an operation of breathtaking audacity and monstrous ambition. Stalin had ignored the warnings both of Churchill, who had passed on intelligence from Ultra, and of his own military advisors. The Red Army, which had suffered catastrophically in the purges of the late 1930s when Stalin had executed or imprisoned thousands of his most experienced officers, was ill-prepared, under-equipped, and badly led. The Soviet defenders recoiled before the searing onslaught. Churchill had long been a staunch anti-Bolshevik, but his unalterable object was the defeat of Hitler. He at once offered to divert precious British supplies to aid the Soviets, a gesture all the more generous since Churchill, like everyone else, assumed another German victory would follow within months, if not weeks. Hitler himself was sufficiently confident to order cuts in munitions supply, and Stalin cabled Churchill with desperate urgency, "The Soviet Union is in mortal peril." Initially, the German divisions enjoyed their accustomed success, often pushing more than 50 miles in a single day. In huge encirclements, they took hundreds of thousands of captives. At first, Stalin was unable to face the crisis, and for 9 days, the great Soviet ship of state drifted rudderless. Then, finding his nerve, Stalin began organizing a resolute defense. Chaos gradually gave way to order. By December, Soviet casualties were running in the millions, and forward German units were in sight of the glinting domes of the Kremlin. But already there were inauspicious omens. Hitler's shifts of strategy had blunted the main thrust of the offensive. The lines of communication were badly overextended. Having been little concerned with the modernity of their equipment, the Germans were dismayed to find the new Soviet armor stronger than expected, and the pitiless Russian winter for which they were completely unprepared was at hand. At this point, Churchill did not yet know he had gained an ally who would win the war. He was much concerned at unfavorable reaction in the virulently anti-communist United States. In August, he met Roosevelt at Placentia Bay for a cordial but largely unproductive meeting. The two leaders liked each other, but liking was one thing, and committing the world's most powerful democracy to a European war was quite another. Stalin, meanwhile, had exerted his considerable talents to the full. Entire factories had been moved east, disassembled and loaded onto freight trains in the dead of winter, reassembled thousands of miles away in the frozen steppe. At however somber a cost to his own peoples, he was rapidly transforming the Soviet Union into a military superpower, and above all, he was choosing commanders on the basis of ability rather than acceptability. Organizing the counterattack in front of Moscow was probably the war's greatest commander, Georgy Zhukov. There would be no more blitzkrieg. Then came the event that transformed the war entirely. On December the 7th, 1941, Admiral Yamamoto's carrier aircraft swept down upon the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, sinking or disabling 8 battleships and killing over 2,000 men. It was a devastating tactical success and a catastrophic strategic blunder, for it ensured, in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, that one of Churchill's most cherished hopes would be fulfilled. America was in the war. Churchill's declaration of war on Japan preceded even that of Roosevelt. The invasion of the Soviet Union had brought a merciful end to the fraught isolation of the 12 long months when Britain alone had grappled with Hitler. Now the world's richest nation was also in the fray. Yet Churchill could not relax immediately. The United States was primarily a naval power, and there was a real possibility she would concentrate on a war in the Pacific, leaving Britain and the mistrusted Soviets to deal with Germany. The suspense was not long. On December the 11th, both Hitler and Mussolini declared war on the United States. Churchill's relief was profound. He was already on his way to Washington, where it was agreed that the defeat of Nazi Germany was the overriding priority. The foundations of a close and unusually effective military alliance were laid. During this trip, the 67-year-old premier suffered a mild heart attack. His physician dared not tell him. Somehow, Churchill's remarkable constitution saw him through. But for 4 months after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese zone of conquest spread ever wider. Churchill, still undervaluing the need for air cover, had sent the Prince of Wales and the Repulse to Malaya unaccompanied by a carrier. Both were sunk. In February, Singapore was forced to a wretched capitulation. Its 180,000 defenders, led off into a cruel and hideous captivity, and the grandeurs and illusions fostered over 100 years of imperial domination crumbled into dust. Singapore was only one in a string of reverses. British public opinion had been outraged by the Channel-2 German battlecruisers escaping from Brest to the Baltic, slipping audaciously through the English Channel itself. By March, Rangoon and most of Burma had fallen to the Japanese despite their logistical inferiority. Rommel was triumphing in North Africa. A formal vote of no confidence was put down in Parliament. Churchill easily survived it, but remained badly in need of some striking military success. In June, Auchinleck fell back to a defensive position at El Alamein where he was able to hold firm. Nevertheless, in nearby Alexandria, panic reigned. Churchill was deeply depressed. In April alone, 700,000 tons of merchant shipping had been lost. Rations were reduced. The mighty conflict was now at its zenith, with both Germany and Japan at the apex of their conquests. Yet neither empire could be sustained. Slowly but steadily, fortune's tide was turning, and although he constantly hoped and dreamed otherwise, the Nazi dictator knew that he had played and lost. With increasing urgency, Hitler began to implement the last and most evil of all his schemes. Hitler's wars had never been wars of conquest and plunder merely. As Churchill had long proclaimed, they were wars of enslavement and extirpation. Europe's Jews and Romanis were the first to feel his terrible flail. But in the perverted Nazi ideology, the Slavic peoples of the East were also irredeemably inferior. The original Eastern plan was of awesome simplicity: kill off most of the subjugated races, reduce the rest to a debased serfdom. It was soon apparent that machine gunning, starvation, and working to death were methods too slow. More efficient means were found. The ceaseless killing took priority even over the war effort, and by their unvarying brutality, the Nazis greatly increased the resolve and indeed the numbers of their enemies. Nowhere was this more evident than in Soviet Russia. The peasants may have had little reason to feel loyal to Stalin, but the cry of Mother Russia in her agony went never unheard by her children. They spared neither their land nor their blood, and wherever the Nazi invaders advanced, they found only a desolation set about with danger. Disappointed with Auchinleck's performance, Churchill passed through Cairo on his way to Moscow and replaced him with Montgomery at the same time, bringing in Alexander from Burma to be supreme commander. They were two of Churchill's best appointments. Montgomery set himself methodically to beating Rommel, first of all assuring himself of complete superiority in men and tanks. Ultra was again indispensable. Knowing always when Rommel's supplies were due, Alexander could see to it that they rarely arrived. When the Second Battle of El Alamein began in late October, not even a Rommel could save the Afrika Korps. They were steadily driven back, first to Benghazi, then to Tunisia, and this time for good. Though not the most spectacular of victories, El Alamein brought an emphatic stop to a long and miserable train of British reverses. Churchill was delighted. The campaign was followed up almost immediately by the first combined Anglo-American venture Operation Torch. The landings in Vichy, North Africa, were beset by political and strategic muddles, and the initiative was lost. Nevertheless, the Axis forces were caught on two sides, and by the 11th of May, the whole of North Africa was in Allied hands. Stalin pressed strongly for a second front, an Allied landing in France that would take the terrible pressure off the Red Army. The Americans, too, wanted an early invasion, but needed at least a year to build up their forces. With both Roosevelt and Churchill impatient for action, North Africa was the only feasible alternative. On his way to Moscow to break this disagreeable news to Stalin, Churchill passed through Cairo. It was there that he made the changes in command that would alter the course of the Desert War. In the early months of '43, the U-boats had come near to winning the war's longest-fought battle, sinking 43 ships during the first 20 days of March alone. The Arctic convoys, too, had suffered grievously. Convoy PQ-17, which Churchill had insisted should sail despite the dangerously light summer nights, had scattered after an alarm, and 2/3 of its ships were lost. The hemorrhage seemed unstoppable, but then, just in time, two new British devices came into play: the Huff-Duff radio location equipment, and yet more decisive, the airborne centimetric radar. The hunters became the hunted. In May, Dönitz was forced to recall his U-boats. Never again were they a serious threat. As bombing was still the only way of striking directly at the enemy, Churchill continued to support Air Marshal Harris, who believed he could win the war by bombing alone. With American participation, the air offensive intensified. In fact, the massive raids, while causing many civilian deaths and much wanton destruction, were of negligible military utility. Throughout 1943, German production soared. So did RAF losses. It was the Americans who eventually found the answer, building one of the outstanding aircraft of the war. The P-51 Mustangs were fitted with drop tanks, an old idea, and could not only accompany the bombers all the way to their targets, but fight magnificently when they got there. Precision daylight bombing at last became possible. It was first used in April of '44 against the synthetic oil plants, with notable success. Over 500,000 men were committed to the invasion of Sicily, which began in July of '43. Between the two commanders, the British Montgomery and the mercurial American Patton, an unfortunate rivalry broke out. Partly as a result, many of the German defenders escaped safely to the mainland. But the fall of Sicily had one important consequence. Mussolini had never enjoyed genuine popular support, and now the tattered sham that had been fascism collapsed virtually overnight. Yet the Germans moved swiftly to assert control, and from being an unreliable ally, Italy became merely an occupied country. Not until September were the Allies able to land at Salerno. Subsequent progress was agonizingly slow, in the face of a resistance both obdurate and skillfully conducted. The Germans had a well-prepared series of great defensive lines. Dislodged with painful effort from one, they would fall back on another no less difficult of assault. By early 1944, the campaign was at stagnation point. Churchill's old project for a drive up what he called the soft underbelly of Europe had run into the hardest of bone. In Churchill's mind was a bold project to break the Italian deadlock by striking at Anzio, 60 miles above the German lines. Roosevelt consented to allow landing craft otherwise destined for the Normandy invasion to be kept on for a time in the Mediterranean. When the Americans landed at Anzio in January of '44, resistance was slight, but yet again, inexcusable delay was followed by near disaster. So far from Anzio relieving the Gustav Line, the line itself had to be carried by dogged frontal attack to relieve Anzio. Then General Clark's drive for Rome allowed the Germans once more to retreat in good order. For the rest of the year, the Allies battered northwards. The ensuing winter stalemate lasted virtually to the end of the war. The Italian campaign was the last occasion on which Churchill had a major hand in strategy. History records an open verdict, and on the vast Eastern Front came the best news of 1943. At Kursk, in the largest tank battle ever fought, the invaders suffered a crushing and crucial defeat. From then on, the Red Army had more and better guns and tanks, increasing air superiority, and up to a 6-to-1 advantage in numbers. The Germans could now hope only to delay, never to prevail. Huge campaigns and unimaginable bloodshed still lay ahead, but Zhukov would reach Berlin. With such victories, Stalin's reputation rose sharply, and so, when the Big Three met at Tehran that December, Churchill, despite appearances, was very much the junior player, but one determined, as far as possible, to keep Britain at the top table. The main agreement to emerge from Tehran was that the Normandy invasion, codenamed Overlord, would be pressed forward with all expedition. Italy would be secondary. Churchill could only acquiesce. After the loss of her Far Eastern possessions, British efforts against the Japanese had been mainly directed to securing India and, under American pressure, to the reopening of the Burma Road. Here, General Slim and the 14th Army performed outstanding service, waging a grueling campaign in some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. But the war against Japan was largely fought with equal courage and flair by the Americans. For Churchill and war-exhausted Britain, the last great battle would be that through France and into Hitler's Reich itself, the preparations for the invasion of France, despite their immense scale, were meticulous. There was again much friction at high levels throughout. Montgomery advocated a sharp, pencil-thin drive into Germany, whereas the American Bradley favored an advance on a broad front. These disagreements would persist long after the first shots were fired, but the Germans were successfully taken in by an elaborate deception plan. Minesweepers, unnoticed, cleared a passage through the Channel waters, and early in the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, the enormous operation finally got underway. Thousands of air sorties were flown, and despite setbacks, by nightfall, over 150,000 men had been landed on the beaches of Normandy. A few days later, Churchill slipped over for a personal inspection, It was no light or easy task that lay ahead. The German soldier was as sternly resilient in retreat as in conquest, and Hitler could still inspire fanatic loyalty. Nevertheless, within a week, a 60-mile beachhead had been consolidated. On the 27th of June, the Americans captured Cherbourg. The British were still held down in the difficult Bocage country. Montgomery had hoped to take Caen on the first day. In fact, the town did not fall until after a month of hard fighting. By the end of July, the Cotentin Peninsula had been secured, and substantial German forces were in danger of encirclement at Falaise, where their armor was badly hit in repeated airstrikes. The pocket was not sealed quickly enough to cut off all the Germans, but 50,000 prisoners were taken, and the roads out of the Falaise Gap were choked with the wreckage of an army in dissolution. Burned-out tanks, dead horses, abandoned vehicles, the debris of Hitler's once invincible Wehrmacht stretched for miles. The rousing call to arms delivered by Churchill was reminiscent of darker times. Let us go on, then, to battle on every front. Thrust forward every man who can be found. Drive on through the storm, now that it reaches its fury, with the same singleness of purpose and inflexibility of resolve as we showed to the world when we were all alone. Soon after D-Day, in a last futile but vicious attempt at breaking British morale, Hitler let loose with the first of his secret weapons. The V-1 flying bombs, pilotless aircraft loaded with explosives. The world's first cruise missiles came buzzing over the channel with their distinctive, terrifying drone. When the engine cut out, there was a moment of silence, and then the explosion. They were dealt with fairly effectively by anti-aircraft batteries and fighter patrols, but the V-2 rockets, which followed in September, were another matter entirely. These were ballistic missiles, traveling faster than sound. The first their victims knew of them was the impact. There was no defense, no warning, no siren. The menace ceased only when the launching sites were overrun by the advancing Allied armies. By then, 9,000 Londoners were dead. London had endured one final ordeal. The Allied advance continued throughout the summer. On the 25th of August, de Gaulle re-entered his beloved Paris. Shortly thereafter, Brussels and Antwerp were also in Allied hands. Montgomery had been in overall charge only for the initial stages, and on the 1st of September, he had to relinquish supreme command to Eisenhower. It was a moment heavy in symbolism. It was now that the normally cautious British general produced a daring plan to outflank the Siegfried Line. The idea was audacious. A carpet of airborne troops would seize a series of bridges in the Netherlands, opening a highway into the heart of the Reich. Brilliantly conceived but imperfectly executed, Operation Market Garden came to grief at Arnhem, where the British 1st Airborne Division was dropped too far from its objective and found itself facing far stronger German forces than intelligence had predicted. The bridge too far, they would call it. Another promise of a swift end to the war had evaporated. Churchill, despite these setbacks, still displayed prodigious energy. He went to Moscow with Eden. He failed to arrange an accommodation between Stalin and the Polish exiles, the Poles whose country had been the very cause of Britain's entry into the war, and whose fate was now being decided over their heads by the great powers. But in a candid discussion over post-war spheres of influence, Churchill secured Stalin's promise not to intervene in Greece. In December of '44, Hitler tried one final, desperate gamble. For the last time, German divisions moved on the offensive in the Ardennes, the same forests through which the panzers had burst so triumphantly in the spring of 1940. For a short while, the attackers savored former glories, punching deep into the American lines and spreading confusion and alarm. But this was not the Wehrmacht of '40. Resistance quickly stiffened. The panzers ran out of fuel, the very oil that the precision bombing campaign had been targeting, and as the mists cleared, they were exposed to murderous airstrikes from which there was no shelter and no escape. In a couple of weeks, the Battle of the Bulge was over. It was Hitler's last throw of the dice, and it had failed. In the new year, another mighty Soviet push brought Zhukov's forward units within 50 miles of Berlin. The Red Army, which had bled more copiously than any force in human history, was now closing in for the kill. That spring, Patton's tanks were scarring the east bank of the Rhine, racing through a Germany that was already unrecognizable, her cities reduced to moonscapes of rubble, her population dazed and starving, her armies disintegrating. The 1,000-year Reich, which had lasted barely 12, lay in its death throes. Roosevelt, the pragmatic, purposeful statesman who had guided America through depression and war alike, died on April the 12th, just weeks before the victory he had done so much to ensure. His nation would emerge from the war far richer and more powerful than ever before. The Allies' progress was not without one dark and indelible revelation. As the armies advanced from east and west, the full compass of the Nazi evil was laid bare for the first time to a horror-struck and disbelieving world. The death camps, the gas chambers, the crematoria still warm, the piles of shoes that had belonged to children, the walking skeletons behind the wire, too weakened even to comprehend that their liberation had come. Churchill's unswerving crusade against the Nazi regime, first as a voice in the political wilderness, then as indomitable war leader, found here its most terrible and most abundant justification. He had warned, year after year, of a monstrous tyranny never surpassed in the dark and lamentable catalogue of human crime. He had been mocked for his alarmism, dismissed as a warmonger, ignored by those who preferred the comfortable fiction that Hitler could be reasoned with. In these terrible memorials to a nameless depravity could alone be written his eternal vindication. And now his great task drew to completion. But the nature of the liberties for which Britain had fought, the very freedoms that distinguished her cause from that of the dictators, was illustrated in remarkable and, for Churchill, deeply painful fashion. While he was at Potsdam, negotiating the shape of the post-war world with Stalin and the new American president, Truman, the British democracy exercised its inalienable right and elected for the coming peace another leader. The man who had saved the nation was voted out of office by the nation he had saved. It was, in its way, a perfect vindication of everything he had fought for, and a bitter personal blow from which he would never entirely recover. 5 years previously, Churchill had warned the British people that they were entering a struggle for the survival of civilization itself, and had promised them victory. Victory at all costs, he had said. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. He had kept that promise, but the cost had indeed been great. Military and civilian casualties had been considerable. Britain's immense war debts would be a burden for generations. Her cities were devastated, her economy in ruins. Scientifically and industrially, she was firmly relegated to the second rank, entering a long decline from which she would never fully recover. The cost had been high, the terror great, the road both long and hard. But Churchill had led his people to a glorious victory. East Prussia, the 20th of July, 1944. It is just past noon, and the summer heat is suffocating. Deep inside a vast military compound hidden among the lakes and forests of Masuria, a one-eyed German colonel walks briskly across a gravel path. His name is Klaus Schenk, Count von Stauffenberg. He is carrying a briefcase, and inside that briefcase is a bomb. Stauffenberg enters the conference room of the Lagerbaracke, the situation barracks at Wolfschanz, the Führer's Eastern Front headquarters. Adolf Hitler is already inside, hunched over a massive oak table, listening to a report on the deteriorating situation in the East. Around the table stand some of the most senior military officers in the Third Reich. Stauffenberg takes his place among them. Exactly 7 minutes later, the world will be forever changed. What is about to unfold is one of the most astonishing chapters in the history of the Second World War, an assassination attempt on the Führer of Nazi Germany, carried out not by Allied commandos or partisan fighters, but by a group of senior officers at the very pinnacle of German military might. They called it Operation Valkyrie, and the man at its center, the man with the briefcase, was a Catholic aristocrat, a decorated war hero, a father of 4, and a man who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers of his left hand fighting for the very regime he was now trying to destroy. This is the story of Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg. It is the story of conscience against obedience, of courage against impossible odds, and of a conspiracy that came within inches of changing the course of history. It is a story of aristocrats and generals, of stolen explosives and forged orders, of a man who bet everything, his life, his family, his honor, on a single briefcase left beneath a conference table. To understand how a loyal German officer became an assassin, we need to go back to the world that made him and the war that broke him. The von Stauffenberg family was one of the oldest and most distinguished aristocratic families of southern Germany. Both Klaus's father, Alfred, and his mother, Caroline, were nobility of rank. Caroline had already presented her husband with 2 sons, the twins, Berthold and Alexander, when, in November of 1907, she decided to travel to Stauffenberg Castle in Jettingen for the birth of her next child. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was carrying twins. One of those twins, Conrad, died shortly after birth, but the other Klaus survived. For the next 10 years, the three boys grew up in the privileged comfort of the German nobility under Kaiser Wilhelm II. The Lautlingen estate, some 50 miles south of Stuttgart, was the home where Klaus was raised and where he would later live with his own family. It was a world of stability, tradition, and duty, a world that felt as permanent as the ancient stone walls of the family castle. In 1914, Germany declared war on both France and Russia. Caroline took tea to the soldiers passing through the local train station. In the summer, she urged her sons to help the local women now deprived of their menfolk with the harvest. In his spare time, young Klaus read voraciously and learned to play the cello, so that he and his brothers could perform as a trio, playing sonatas by Mozart and Haydn. He was, by all accounts, a sensitive and deeply thoughtful boy. The day they learned that Germany had requested an armistice, Klaus was in tears. He was still a boy when that war ended in Germany's defeat, and in what was seen by so many people, including Stauffenberg's own family, as the national humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. Germany was thrown into chaos. Various mobs, communist and right-wing, vied for power. The turmoil of those years prepared the way for the rise of the dictatorship of Adolf Hitler, and the political upheaval of that era made a powerful impression on young Klaus. He resolved to become an officer, for he believed that the officer corps had always served as a powerful, stabilizing force in German life. In 1926, he joined the family's traditional regiment, the 17th Cavalry Regiment, in Bamberg. Klaus had grown to be a tall and strikingly handsome young man, with a shock of dark hair, prominent cheekbones, a firm jaw, and what those who knew him described as dreamy, contemplative eyes. He was a deeply devout Catholic. He always attended Mass on Sunday, and he carried with him a conviction that would one day tear his life apart, the belief that there was always a greater authority than any earthly leader, a greater authority than even the Führer. One day, in Bamberg, he met a pretty young 16-year-old called Nina. She was at a local girls' boarding school. In 1930, after he had been promoted to second lieutenant, Klaus proposed to her, even though he was only 23. On the 26th of September, 1933, 8 months after Hitler became chancellor, Nina and Klaus were married at St. James's Church in Bamberg. He was in uniform, and he wore his steel helmet to the ceremony. To wed is to be on duty, he explained to Nina. In 1936, Klaus took the entrance exam to Berlin's prestigious War Academy. His military career progressed rapidly. By 1937, he was a cavalry captain, and in 1938, he was assigned as a general staff officer to the 1st Light Division, later known as the 6th Panzer Division. His cousin, Count Cäsar von Hofacker, was already living in Berlin on the Kaiser Wilhelmstrasse. Hofacker's son would later recall the bond between them. My father was a direct cousin of Count Klaus Stauffenberg. My grandmother and the mother of Klaus Stauffenberg were sisters. There was a very close relationship, and I think that had definitely something to do with why my father ended up in the resistance. That same year, 1938, the SA and SS launched the so-called Kristallnacht, when the shops and homes of Jews were smashed and many synagogues were burned to the ground. Stauffenberg had supported the idea of restricting Jewish influence in the arts and public life, a view common among the conservative German aristocracy of his era, but he strongly condemned this violence. His gradual disillusionment with the Nazi regime had irrevocably begun. Stauffenberg was serving as quartermaster of the 1st Light Division when Hitler decided to invade Poland in September of 1939. When a fellow officer tried to persuade him to help overthrow Hitler in November of that year, Stauffenberg's answer was telling. "I'm not ready yet," he said, and there was a practical reality behind those words. He was a captain on the general staff. How many opportunities to oppose a dictator and commander-in-chief are open to a captain? Stauffenberg's entire ethos was that the army existed to uphold and defend Germany. He was a loyal member of the Wehrmacht that marched into Poland. This was the regime that was leading his country, and he believed, to some extent, that this war had been forced upon Germany, that it was not solely the product of Hitler's reckless foreign policy. It was a belief that would not survive what came next. On the 10th of May, 1940, Stauffenberg was with the 6th Panzer Division as its tanks plunged into Luxembourg and Belgium, creating the spearhead of the armored divisions that crossed the Meuse and raced across France. French resistance crumbled more quickly than division headquarters in the rear could keep track of. 1 week later, to his infinite disappointment, Stauffenberg was withdrawn from the front and promoted to the Army General Staff. Before taking up his new post, Stauffenberg found time to see his family. He was now the proud father of 3 children, Franz Ludwig, Heimermann, and Berthold, named after his elder brother. 1 year later, Nina had their 4th child, a girl they called Valerie. From his perch at the Army General Staff, Stauffenberg witnessed the invasion of the Soviet Union in June of 1941. The initial advances were staggering. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. It seemed, for a time, as if nothing could stop the German war machine. But it was not until later that year that the real nature of this war, its true, monstrous character, began to reveal itself. Reports of the systematic killing of Jews and Gypsies by SS troops started reaching the higher levels of the Wehrmacht. The Holocaust was already underway, and in its early stages on the Eastern Front, it was a staggeringly brutal affair, not the industrialized killings that would later occur at Auschwitz, but something raw, something more visceral and more personal in its horror. Pits were dug in fields and forests. Civilians, men, women, children, were lined up at the edge and shot. Entire communities were erased in a single afternoon. Reports of each of these atrocities traveled up through the military chain of command, and they reached officers like Stauffenberg, who read them with a growing sense of horror and disbelief. If one looks at the total number of Jews exterminated in the Holocaust, by far the largest number came from the former Soviet Union, from Byelorussia, from Ukraine, from the Baltic states. These were the territories the Germans occupied in the summer and fall of 1941, and truly horrible things happened there. Large-scale killings, carried out with methodical brutality by SS special forces known as Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units, whose sole purpose was extermination. Major General Henning von Tresckow, who was serving on the Eastern Front in Army Group Center, had been plotting Hitler's overthrow since the late 1930s. Von Tresckow understood that the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front had a unique opportunity to incubate a conspiracy, given its relative independence from the SD, the Gestapo, and the SS. In July of 1941, von Tresckow received a visitor from the General Staff Stauffenberg. The young officer agreed with Tresckow that Hitler was a danger, but he was not yet ready to join the conspiracy. As late as the second half of 1942, during one of his fact-finding tours in Ukraine, Stauffenberg remained convinced that the Eastern Front could be held. But in that same year, Stauffenberg received the first reports of the mass murder of Russian Jews by the Einsatzgruppen, and he was astonished. He was horrified. These were not battlefield casualties. These were not the collateral damages of war. This was systematic, deliberate extermination. Men, women, and children murdered for no reason other than who they were. And it was being done in Germany's name. That, historians believe, is where his real conversion to the cause came. From his religious background, from his Catholic faith, there is always a greater authority, a moral law that stands above orders, above loyalty, above even the oath of allegiance to the Führer. All of this came together in the mind and conscience of Klaus von Stauffenberg, and it turned a loyal member of the officer caste into a rebel. The transformation was not sudden. It had been building for years, through Kristallnacht, through the invasion of Poland, through the staggering arrogance of the Russian campaign. But the Einsatzgruppen reports were the point of no return. After that, there was no going back. He began a one-man campaign to convince commanders at the Eastern Front to confront Hitler and wrest control from him. He traveled from headquarters to headquarters, from staff meeting to staff meeting, speaking with a bluntness that startled even those who shared his views. He was so vocal in his criticism that his fellow officers became genuinely concerned, not just for his safety, but for their own. To be heard agreeing with such talk was to risk everything. That winter of 1942, the German army came to a halt before the gates of Stalingrad. What followed was one of the most catastrophic defeats in military history. Even when the Sixth Army under General von Paulus faced certain annihilation, surrounded, starving, and freezing in the ruins of a city that had been ground to dust, Hitler refused to authorize a withdrawal. He ordered them to fight to the last man. The Sixth Army was destroyed, and for Stauffenberg, watching from the general staff as an entire army was sacrificed to one man's vanity, the last thread of loyalty snapped. Hitler had to be removed, not tomorrow, not when conditions were right, now. But his fellow officers, alarmed by the ferocity of his conviction, decided it was safer to post him far from Berlin, far from the corridors of power where his words could do the most damage. He was transferred to the 10th Panzer Division in Tunisia, as far from the conspiracy as they could send him. It was meant to protect him. Instead, it nearly killed him. In Libya and Tunisia, the victories of the famed Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel had been reversed. The Americans had landed in North Africa during Operation Torch. Rommel launched a daring panzer attack against the still inexperienced American troops, driving them all the way to the Kasserine Pass. But the victory was short-lived. The Germans began a fighting retreat. On the 7th of April, 1943, Stauffenberg tried to lead his column through the narrow El Hafa Pass. Fighter bombers caught up with them. The attack was devastating. Stauffenberg was badly injured. He was taken to a field hospital in Sfax, where doctors did what they could. When it was over, he had lost his right hand, 2 fingers on his left hand, and his left eye. His recovery was slow but steady. On the 5th of July, he arrived back in Lautlingen for a month-long convalescence. Here, he was reunited with his children Heimermann, Franz Ludwig, and little Valerie, as well as his niece Elizabeth and nephew Alfred. The estate that had been his childhood home now became a place of healing, of quiet afternoons in the garden, of the soft voices of children who did not yet understand the storm gathering around their father. Stauffenberg learned to write with his remaining 3 fingers. He learned to dress himself, to eat, to manage the daily indignities of a body that had been torn apart by war. Those who saw him during this period remarked on something striking, not despair, but a kind of fierce, concentrated purpose, as if the injuries had burned away everything that was not essential, leaving behind only the will to act. But even as he recovered, Stauffenberg's mind was at work. He had gone to war believing in his duty as an officer. He had come home from war believing in something greater, the duty to act against tyranny, even at the cost of his own life. Around that time, the position of Chief of Staff of the General Army Office in the Bendlerstrasse in Berlin became vacant. General Albrecht, well aware of Stauffenberg's commitment to remove Hitler, quietly arranged for Stauffenberg to be offered the post. Stauffenberg immediately agreed. In August of 1943, Stauffenberg arranged to meet with Henning von Tresckow to discuss the implementation of the Valkyrie Plan. Now, Valkyrie was, on the surface, an official German plan for dealing with a massive internal disturbance, whether it might be an uprising of foreign laborers or a concentrated air raid that disrupted local services. By 1944, there were 7.5 million foreign workers in Germany, and the regime genuinely feared the possibility of civil unrest. The reserve army troops with officers at the Bendlerstrasse were the men designated to execute Operation Valkyrie, and the conspirators in the resistance, the men at the Bendlerstrasse, were the ones who controlled that plan. It seemed only logical for them to turn that operational plan to their own devices. Together, Stauffenberg and Tresckow began drafting an outline of the new government that would take charge immediately after the coup d'etat. General Ludwig Beck would become head of state. The longtime resistor Karl Friedrich Goerdeler would become Germany's new chancellor. Von Tresckow would take control of all German security services, including Himmler's Gestapo and SD. General Hübner would become head of the Ministry of War. Either Albrecht or Stauffenberg himself would serve as state secretary. The only minister in Hitler's government whom the plotters intended to retain, if he agreed, was the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer. Under Speer's leadership, armaments production had actually increased despite the devastating British and American bombing campaigns. Years later, Speer himself confirmed his knowledge of the plan. He knew that he had been penciled in to serve as Minister of War in the new government, had the assassination been carried off successfully. Stauffenberg increasingly became the core of the Valkyrie plan. But one major problem remained. Neither von Tresckow nor other conspirators, such as Merz von Quernheim, had actual access to the Führer. The conspiracy had a plan. It had an organization. It had willing men, but it lacked what it needed most: someone who could get close enough to Hitler to kill him. And then, in June of 1944, Fate delivered what the conspirators had been waiting for. Stauffenberg was appointed chief of staff to none other than General Fromm, the head of the Home Army. Hitler frequently wanted to be apprised of its combat readiness, and so Stauffenberg suddenly found himself in a position where he himself would see Hitler on a regular basis. Of all the conspirators, he was now the best placed to become the assassin. At the same time, the conspiracy was expanding. Field Marshal Rommel, commander of Army Group B in France, had finally agreed to cooperate. The western arm of the conspiracy was headed by the military governor of France, General von Stülpnagel. Its success depended heavily on Stülpnagel and his deputy, none other than Stauffenberg's cousin, Cäsar von Hofacker. Hofacker's son would later describe the relationship. Stülpnagel was his immediate boss, and I think my father and Stülpnagel were very good friends at the end. Another key figure was General von Hasse, the military commander of Berlin. The plotters had men in all the right places, or so they believed, but there was a critical flaw in the plan, and everyone could see it. Stauffenberg could not be in two places at once. He was instrumental in organizing the operation of Valkyrie in Berlin. He needed to be there. He was a tremendously powerful, dynamic man who could pick up the phone and talk to all corners of Germany at once and convince everybody to act in the way they should. His energy, his conviction, his sheer force of personality were irreplaceable. The coup had no chance without him directing it from the Bendlerstrasse. But at the same time, he had come to realize that summer that he also had to be the assassin, which meant being 300 miles to the east, planting a bomb in the map room at Rastenburg. He had to light the fuse and then somehow get back to Berlin to orchestrate the aftermath. It was a contradiction that would prove fatal to the conspiracy, because it meant that for the critical hours between the explosion and the activation of Valkyrie, the man who should have been commanding the coup would instead be sitting in an airplane. Since Stauffenberg had to remain alive and return to Berlin to orchestrate the coup, he could not use a suicide device. He would have to use a timer, a fuse, and then get out. His co-conspirator, Colonel Helmut Stief, secured the necessary bombs and fuses from a trusted contact. The explosives were British-made, obtained from captured supplies. The fuses required a special pair of pliers to activate you, squeezed the casing to break a glass vial of acid, which then slowly ate through a wire holding back a spring-loaded striker. When the wire snapped, the detonator fired. It was crude, it was dangerous, and for a man with only 3 fingers on one hand, it was an almost impossible task. The Valkyrie plan's objective was clear: decapitate the German leadership. Field Marshals von Kluge and Rommel insisted that not only Hitler but also Himmler, head of the SS, and Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe and Hitler's designated successor, should be eliminated. The problem was that these 3 men were rarely together. On the 11th of July, Stauffenberg traveled to the Berghof Hitler's mountain retreat with Stief. They were ready to detonate the bomb, but neither Himmler nor Göring was present. Stief decided to call it off. 3 days later, Hitler moved his headquarters from the Berghof to Wolfschanz, the Wolf's Lair. Originally built in 1941 in preparation for Operation Barbarossa, Wolfschanz had since been expanded into a vast complex comprising 3 security rings. The outer ring, Security Zone 2, contained barracks and facilities for staff and guests, a communications center, and a mess hall known as Casino 2. To the northeast lay Security Zone 1, containing the offices of top figures in the Nazi leadership, including Göring, General Jodl, and Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel. And to the immediate left of Zone 1 was the most heavily guarded sector of all the Führer Zone. Here was a massive bunker reserved for the Führer himself, as well as air raid shelters and various wooden barracks, one of which contained a map situation room. On the 14th of July, Stauffenberg and General Fromm were summoned to appear at Wolfschanz the following day. In a famous photograph from that visit, Stauffenberg stands ramrod straight as Hitler greets General Bodensatz of the Luftwaffe. Look at that photograph closely, and you see a man whose face betrays nothing: no fear, no hesitation, no hint of the terrible resolve burning behind that single remaining eye. Back in Berlin, General Albrecht was already issuing preliminary orders for Valkyrie. But once again, Stauffenberg was prevented from setting the bomb. Himmler and Göring were not in attendance. Kluge and Rommel had been explicit. All 3 had to be eliminated, or the SS and Luftwaffe might retaliate and plunge Germany into civil war. Still, the visit was not wasted. It served as a dress rehearsal, and Stauffenberg was a meticulous planner. He observed that the chance of activating the bomb inside the Führer bunker itself was slim. The security was too tight, the opportunities too few. He would have to break the fuses somewhere else, preferably in Keitel's office complex, where a request to use a private room would not arouse suspicion. He also noted that the distance between the two buildings was about 400 meters, roughly 10 minutes on foot. A 10-minute fuse would not do. The acid would eat through the wire too quickly. He would still be inside the blast radius. He would need 30-minute fuses. The clock, quite literally, was being calibrated. Every detail mattered. Every second would count. On the morning of the 20th of July, 1944, a Heinkel 111 carrying Stauffenberg and his aide, Lieutenant Werner von Haeften, touched down at Rastenburg. The situation on the Eastern Front was extremely critical. The weather was very hot, and the humidity high, conditions that Hitler did not like. The overall mood at the Führer's headquarters was tense. Back in Germany, Nina von Stauffenberg went about her day not knowing what her husband was about to attempt. She later recalled, "I didn't know that my husband was going to try the assassination himself. He did tell me that, in case the attempt should fail, I shouldn't try to be loyal to him. The most important thing," he said, "was that one of us should survive to look after the children." Stauffenberg sat down for breakfast. Joining him was Captain von Mollendorf, adjutant to the Wolfschanze commander, a chance encounter that would later prove critical. Shortly after 11 o'clock, accompanied by von Haeften, Stauffenberg proceeded to the office of Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel in preparation for his presentation to the Führer. Here, Stauffenberg received some disturbing news. The conference would not take place in the bunker as usual, but in a wooden building reinforced with concrete, the Lagerbaracke, the situation barracks. This was devastating. In the confined concrete space of the bunker, the bomb blast would have been contained. Everyone inside would have been killed, but a wooden building would allow the blast to dissipate through the walls, the windows, the very structure itself. The odds of killing Hitler had just plummeted. Then came a second blow. Keitel was told that the briefing had been rescheduled, moved forward to 12:30. Given the pending visit of Mussolini, they would have to hurry. Stauffenberg knew the bomb had to be activated immediately, but he could not simply pull out a pair of pliers and start squeezing fuse casings in front of Keitel and his staff. He asked Keitel if he could change his shirt, a plausible request in the oppressive East Prussian heat, and one that a badly wounded officer could make without suspicion. Keitel's aide, John von Freytag, took the officers to a nearby bedroom. What happened in that room over the next few minutes was one of the most extraordinary acts of physical courage in the history of the war. A one-eyed man with 3 remaining fingers on one hand, fingers that had to manipulate a pair of special pliers with enough precision to crush a tiny glass vial of acid inside a metal fuse casing, worked feverishly. Against the clock, knowing that Keitel was growing impatient, knowing that every second of delay increased the chance of discovery. Haeften assisted, taking the activated fuse and inserting it into the block of plastic explosive. At that moment, at the worst possible moment, von Freytag tried to open the door to tell Stauffenberg about a phone call from General Felgebel at the communications post. Haeften had just finished arming the first bomb, but the second fuse had not been crushed. Keitel sent word that Stauffenberg must hurry. There was no time to argue, no time to try again. They had run out of time. One bomb would have to do. Von Freytag offered to carry Stauffenberg's briefcase. Stauffenberg refused. "I want to sit as close to the Führer as possible," he said. "My hearing is very bad." It was a lie, of course, but a convincing one. A man with one eye and a mangled hand could easily be believed to have impaired hearing. At 12:35, they reached the conference room. Hitler was listening to a report by General Adolf Husinger, a friend of Trescow's, and the only general in the room who was aware that a plot to kill Hitler was brewing. Around the massive oak table stood some of the most powerful military men in Germany. Colonel Heinz Brandt, Colonel Rudolf Schmundt, a senior adjutant, Colonel Heinrich Borgmann of the Wehrmacht, General Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff, and his deputy, General Warlimont. Neither Goering nor Himmler was present, but Stauffenberg knew he must proceed. There would be no more chances. Von Freytag stepped forward and asked Colonel Brandt to move aside so that Stauffenberg, with his injuries, could be closer to Hitler. Brandt obliged. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase beneath the table, near the heavy wooden support post, as close to Hitler as he could manage. Then he told von Freytag that he had to make a phone call, and left the room. What happened next would determine the fate of nations. Outside, Stauffenberg walked quickly away from the conference room, out of the Führer zone, toward the adjutant's building where he knew General Feldgiebel would be waiting. Back inside, Huizinger's presentation continued. The seconds ticked by, and then at 12:42, the bomb detonated. Glass and wood splinters shot through the air. The massive table on which all the situation maps were spread collapsed. The room filled with smoke and debris, and the acrid smell of burning wood and scorched fabric. Men were hurled against walls. The ceiling buckled. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, the terrible, ringing silence that follows an explosion. And then, through the chaos, a voice cried out, "Where is the Führer?" 4 men were killed outright or would die of their wounds in the days that followed Colonel Brandt, the very officer who had unknowingly moved the briefcase, General Schmundt, General Korten, and the stenographer Berger. Several others were severely injured. The conference room was devastated, its wooden walls blown outward, its windows shattered, its roof torn open to the summer sky. But Adolf Hitler, shielded by the heavy oak table and the massive wooden support post, was alive, dazed, his hair singed, his trousers shredded, his eardrums perforated but alive. He staggered from the wreckage under his own power, and within minutes, the machinery of the Nazi state began to close around the conspirators like a steel trap. In the turmoil that followed the explosion, Stauffenberg and von Haeften made their escape. As they passed the site of the shattered situation barracks, Stauffenberg saw a corpse being carried out on a stretcher, covered with Hitler's long trench coat. He was certain, absolutely certain, that he had just killed Adolf Hitler. At the first security ring, and then again at the second checkpoint, they were allowed to proceed. The Wolfschanz commandant had ordered a complete lockdown, but the order had not yet taken full effect. At the last checkpoint, Stauffenberg was stopped. He decided to call the compound commander directly. By a stroke of luck, he was put through to Captain von Mollendorf, the very officer with whom he had had breakfast that morning. Mollendorf gave him the go-ahead to leave. On the way to the airport, von Haeften opened his briefcase and threw the second, unused bomb into the woods. Their Heinkel took off at 1:15 in the afternoon. Back at Wolfschanz, the truth was already emerging. Hitler was alive. The heavy oak table and the wooden post had shielded him from the worst of the blast. His shoulder was injured. His eardrums were damaged. His right arm was hurt. He would later put his hand between the buttons of his tunic, like Napoleon, to support it. But he was alive, and he was already beginning to suspect who was responsible. Feldgiebel, the head of communications at Wolfschanz, saw that something had gone terribly wrong. A rumor was spreading that Hitler had survived with only minor injuries. Although a communications blackout was nominally in effect, the devastating news began to reach Berlin. At the Bendlerstrasse, General Albrecht received word that the plot may have failed. He made a fateful decision: to wait, to do nothing until Stauffenberg could report in person. Precious hours were wasted hours during which the conspirators still held the element of surprise. When Stauffenberg finally landed in Berlin, he found that nothing had been done. The Valkyrie orders had not been issued. The military units had not been mobilized. The window of opportunity was slamming shut. General Fromm, commander of the Home Army, refused to activate Plan Valkyrie. He said he had just spoken with Keitel at Wolfschanz and was told that the Führer was very much alive. Stauffenberg, who believed he had seen Hitler's corpse with his own eyes, insisted that the news from Wolfschanz was a trick, a deception that the SS was seizing control and feeding false information to prevent the army from acting. The argument grew heated. He ordered all the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Stauffenberg was not a man who accepted defeat easily. He put Fromm under arrest instead. Together with Albrecht and Merz von Quernheim, he frantically began issuing telex orders to army units across Germany, urging them to move to their assigned locations. The coup, delayed by hours of indecision, lurched into motion. In Paris, everything went according to plan for a time. Hofacker moved with precision and speed. He went ahead and arrested all the major figures of the SS and the Gestapo in the city. But then came the problem that everyone had feared. Field Marshal Klug, the head of the military in France, had known about the resistance but had never definitively committed. There is a famous phrase attributed to Klug, one that captures the agonizing paralysis of the conspirators who hesitated. "Gentlemen, as long as that pig lives, I cannot." Klug would take his own life just 4 weeks later. And then, in Berlin, the final blow fell. The clatter of typewriters in the Bendlerstrasse came to a halt when Radio Berlin issued a communiqué. There had been an attempt on the Führer's life, the announcement declared, but Hitler was alive and would speak on the radio shortly. Looking back, it was not one failure but a sequence of events that had doomed the conspiracy from the moment the bomb detonated. The first factor was von Freytag's decision to place Stauffenberg to the right of Hitler, next to Huizinga. When Brandt later kicked the briefcase, he moved it to the other side of the heavy wooden post, which then served as a shield, protecting Hitler from the full force of the blast. Had Stauffenberg been placed to Hitler's left, the explosion might have been fatal. Significantly, all of the officers killed in the blast were standing to the right of the briefcase, unshielded by any of the posts. The second setback was the phone call from Feldgiebel, compounded by Keitel's impatience, which had prevented the activation of the second bomb. If Stauffenberg had been able to place both bombs in the conference room, the combined force of the explosion would almost certainly have killed everyone inside, including Hitler. But the most important factor of all was the decision to move the meeting from the bunker to the wooden conference room. Had the bomb exploded within the concrete confines of the bunker, the blast would have been contained. The pressure wave would have had nowhere to go. Everyone in the room would have been killed. Hitler was convinced that he had been saved by Providence, by the hand of God itself. Shaking hands with his left arm, since his right was injured, he proudly welcomed his guest that afternoon, Italy's former dictator, Benito Mussolini. As he showed Mussolini the ruins of the barracks, he said, "You see, there's nothing left of it. And yet, I got out without a scratch." Until that moment, suspicion had fallen on the laborers working on the barracks. But the sudden disappearance of Stauffenberg put things in an entirely different light. By evening, Hitler knew that a clique of army officers had been responsible. Back in Berlin, the final act had begun. Major Remmer, who had defied General von Hasse's orders to support the coup, arranged his troops around the Bendlerstrasse. Soon thereafter, Remmer's forces were reinforced and then replaced by the SS. Valkyrie was lost. Fromm was released from his confinement and promptly ordered the conspirators to be placed under arrest. But Fromm had a problem of his own. He had known about the conspiracy, perhaps not every detail, but enough to implicate him. And he knew that if the plotters survived to face interrogation, they would talk. Eager to cover up his complicity, Fromm decided to dispose of the conspirators immediately, before any investigation could begin. Stauffenberg, von Haeften, Albrecht, and Merz von Quernheim were summarily condemned to death. There was no trial, no deliberation. An execution detail was formed, and the condemned men were marched to the courtyard of the Bendler block. The scene was lit by the headlights of military vehicles, casting long, stark shadows across the cobblestones. At the same time, Hitler was making his radio address from Wolfschanz. His voice, shaking with rage and something that might have been disbelief, carried across the airwaves of the Reich. His final words were a declaration, "Long live our sacred Germany." It was 1 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of July, 1944, when the shots rang out in the courtyard of the Bendlerstrasse. Klaus von Stauffenberg was 36 years old. Fate had perhaps been merciful to him, for what followed was far worse than a swift execution. The attempt convinced Hitler that the Wehrmacht leadership could not be trusted. He launched a savage purge of the officer corps, and used the shock of the attack to round up all the surviving members of the old opposition throughout the Reich. Those officers who had been injured or killed by the bomb were hailed as heroes. Hitler went in person to the Rastenburg hospital to pay his respects to them. For the conspirators who were captured alive, there would be no mercy and no dignity. Hitler ordered a series of show trials in the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court, presided over by a dreaded judge named Roland Freisler. The trials were a grotesque theater of humiliation. Even high-ranking officers, men like Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben, were forced to appear in shabby, ill-fitting clothes, their belts removed so they had to hold up their trousers, their uniforms stripped away, their medals confiscated in a calculated effort to destroy every last shred of their former dignity before the cameras. Freisler screamed at the defendants, mocked them, interrupted their attempts to speak. He was not a judge, he was a performer, playing to an audience of one. The proceedings were filmed and sent to Hitler for his private viewing. Some of those convicted were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks, their final agonies recorded on film. It was cruelty beyond comprehension, but it was also, in its way, a measure of the conspirators' courage. The regime would not have needed such elaborate vengeance against men it did not fear. War had been ravaging the East since 1937, when Japan's invasion of China tore open a wound that would never fully heal. That war reached Europe on the 1st of September, 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, and it became truly global on the 7th of December, 1941, when Japanese aircraft descended on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. It touched every continent. It lasted for 6 years, and it ended with a new weapon and a new age. This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. The men and women whose voices carry through this account are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and the tragedies of the war, wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made by those who could pay, and those who could no longer meet the price of empire. Their words were recorded decades after the events they describe, but the clarity of their memories, the precision of detail, the rawness of emotion, speaks to the depth of what they experienced. These were moments that burned themselves into the mind and could not be erased by the passage of time. Both of the main Axis partners had enjoyed extraordinary success with their initial offensives. Germany had swept through Central Europe and Western Europe and had launched a devastating invasion of the Soviet Union. Japan had conquered vast swaths of the Pacific, Burma, Malaya, the Philippines, and the Dutch East Indies. For a time, it seemed as though the old order was crumbling beyond repair, but by 1943, the complexion of the war had changed. By the turn of that year, the Axis was on the defensive everywhere. The question was no longer whether the Allies could survive, it was whether they could finish the job. And through 1944, in every theater of war, Allied strength would grow in the East, in the Soviet Union, and with the long-awaited opening of the Second Front. What follows is the story of that pivotal year, 1944, drawn from the testimony of the men who fought it. From the frozen skies over Berlin to the steaming jungles of Burma, from the turquoise waters of the Pacific to the ancient hills of Italy, from the vast, churned mud of the Eastern Front to the beaches of Normandy. In every one of these places, ordinary men were asked to do extraordinary things. Their voices, recorded decades later, carry the weight of everything they witnessed. 1944 would be the year that the tide turned decisively, the year that the machinery of liberation was set into motion across the globe, and the year that the price of empire would be paid in full. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was relentless. Through 1943, it had intensified, and by the turn of 1944, it was consuming everything the Luftwaffe had left. The dwindling stocks of German fighter aircraft, which could have made a valuable contribution on the Eastern Front, were instead committed to the defense of German cities and German industry. Tens of thousands of military personnel were pulled from the front lines to man anti-aircraft batteries and civil defense units. For 6 months, from September of 1943 to the last day of March, 1944 RAF and American bombers hammered German targets without pause. From January, the bomber crews were supported by long-range fighter escorts as the P-51 Mustangs came into service, transforming the air war. One American airman recalled the conditions with a plainness that belied their severity. "We flew at 30,000 feet with no heat in the plane, so it was really cold. We had a flight suit which looked like an electric blanket with a plug at the navel, which had a cord we could plug into the airplane, and it would heat our suit, which made it really comfortable. We were okay. At 30,000 feet, in unpressurized bombers, over hostile territory, they were okay." It was the kind of understatement that only men who had lived through it could manage. RAF Bomber Command, under the leadership of Arthur Harris, continued its concentration on German cities. Encouraged by the devastating raids that had unleashed a firestorm on Hamburg, killing more than 40,000 people, Harris turned his attention to the capital. What followed became known as the Battle of Berlin. The Führer himself moved around the city with the curtains drawn in his car, unwilling to see the damage being done to his capital. But despite extensive and repeated raids, the bombing failed to cripple Berlin. One navigator described the technology that guided them through the darkness over Germany. "By the time I got there, we had something called GH. I had a screen as navigator in my part of the plane where I could know exactly where I was if there was cloud cover, which there usually was. I would use that. Otherwise, I just had to do dead reckoning and try to recognize the drift." These were men flying blind through flak and night fighters, guided by instruments that were revolutionary for their time but crude by any modern standard. Where Bomber Command's area bombing of cities produced mixed results, attacking specific military objectives proved more effective. In February of 1944, a concentrated effort known as Big Week saw the RAF and the United States 8th and 15th Air Forces drop more than 15,000 tons of explosives on aircraft factories and aircraft component plants. The assault permanently crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to replace its losses. The spirit among the bomber crews, despite the appalling casualties, remained resolute. One airman remembered it clearly. The spirit through the whole thing was one of purpose. The camaraderie was excellent. The acceptance of losing a buddy was excellent. It was never a question of, we shouldn't be here. We shouldn't be doing this. Never, by anyone. These were men who understood the cost and paid it willingly, night after night, mission after mission. But by the spring of 1944, it had become clear that bombing alone would not bring a population to its knees and end the war. At the end of March, Bomber Command launched a raid on Nuremberg, in which 94 bombers were shot down and 540 aircrew were killed, a greater death toll than Fighter Command had suffered during the whole of the Battle of Providence. Britain and Nuremberg itself suffered minimal damage. Consider what those numbers meant. 94 bombers. Each one carried a crew of 7 men. In a single night, over the skies of a single German city, nearly 700 airmen were lost, killed, captured, or missing, and the target they had been sent to destroy was barely scratched. It was the raid that ended Arthur Harris's Battle of Berlin. In total, over 1,000 aircraft had been lost in the campaign against the German capital. The bombers were needed elsewhere now. They were transferred to a new and decisive task, their role in the coming invasion of Europe. Across the globe, from the shattered cities of Germany, it was Allied forces that were facing invasion. In Burma, the Imperial Japanese Army renewed its offensive operations, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Chinese were almost entirely dependent on their allies for modern military equipment. In 1943, the delivery of those supplies had been drastically curtailed by the loss of Burma and the Burma Road. Efforts to construct an alternative route, the Lido Road, had faltered with the onset of the monsoon rains. The Allied plan for 1944 was focused on a single objective: securing northern Burma so that the Lido Road could be completed and the supply line to China restored. The plan was ambitious and depended on coordination across vast distances and difficult terrain. The American General Joseph Stilwell, commanding the Chinese army in Burma, would move south from Lido to the Burmese border, then swing north, building the road as he went. Meanwhile, British General Ord Wingate's long-range penetration group, the Chindits, would be airlifted deep behind Japanese lines to the Irrawaddy, cutting Japanese communications south of Stilwell's force. And the Chinese Expeditionary Force operating out of China under General Wei Li Huang would move against the Japanese at Tengchung, pushing the 56th Division toward Wingate's blocking positions. That plan was initiated on February the 5th, when the first elements of the Chindits began their march from Lido into the jungle. But the following day, the Japanese struck first. The 55th Division moved north with the intention of looping around and attacking the 15th Indian Corps from the rear. It was a bold and dangerous flanking maneuver. As the Japanese offensive gathered momentum, Allied attempts to gain an advantage in the Burmese state of Arakan were called off. But there was a silver lining. It was the first time that British and Indian troops had successfully repelled a Japanese assault. One soldier who fought in those jungles remembered the reality of the terrain and the enemy with vivid clarity. "I was a forward scout, about 100 yards up on the rest of the section. Really couldn't see anything. All you could see was a massive greenery. All of a sudden, a shot rang out, and I couldn't go forward then, because I didn't know how many Japs there were. There was just that one shot, and they shot our corporal." He paused, then continued. "I was expecting to get shot carrying him back. They brought in the Americans, bombing the top of the hill where the Japs were. They pulled out during the night, so that was that." In the jungles of Burma, survival was measured in yards and seconds. In early March, the Chindits were flown into the Kaukwe Valley, and for once, an airborne assault went well. An early Japanese attempt to dislodge the force was easily beaten off, but south of the Chindit landing zone, the major part of the Japanese offensive got underway a week earlier than General William Slim, commanding the defense, had anticipated. With the Japanese came a division of the Indian National Army, raised by the Indian independence leader Subhas Chandra Bose from Indian prisoners of the Japanese. These men, on crossing the Chindwin River, fell to their knees, shouting "Jai Hind, Hail India." For them, this was a war of liberation. For the British, it was a fight for survival. The Japanese 33rd Division made progress before turning north and beginning to threaten Imphal. The 20th Indian Division was ordered to take a position on the Imphal Road and hold it. For 3 months of fierce fighting, they held it. Meanwhile, the Japanese objective to the north became clear. Kohima was a major base. More importantly, it was a railhead and the gateway to Dimapur, an enormous supply depot for the British in India. If it fell, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Japanese 15th Division cut the Imphal-Kohima road as they closed on the town. In the midst of the crisis, the British command suffered a devastating setback. Orda Wingate, in the tradition of those eccentric British soldier mystics like Gordon of Khartoum and Lawrence of Arabia, was killed in a plane crash. Command of the Chindits passed to Stilwell. On April the 3rd, the Japanese 31st Division closed on Kohima. On that same day, one British infantry battalion arrived to garrison the depot. What followed was one of the most desperate defensive battles of the entire war. Besieged and outnumbered, the garrison fought for 2 weeks. The perimeter contracted day by day, yard by yard. More and more of the village fell in fierce hand-to-hand combat. At times, less than 15 meters separated the opposing front lines, close enough to hear the enemy breathing, close enough to throw grenades into each other's positions. One defender recalled the conditions simply, "We existed on parachute supplies. They dropped the rations by parachute," which the Japs never had. Nothing like that. That asymmetry, the ability to sustain a besieged force from the air, would prove to be the decisive difference. Japan's failure to supply and support her troops would prove to be a fatal weakness. 60% of Japan's 1.74 million military losses during the entire war were victims not of enemy fire, but of starvation or disease. At Kohima, this failure was already taking hold. On April the 18th, a Punjabi battalion and a tank detachment succeeded in breaking through to the besieged garrison. The defenders had suffered 300 casualties, but they had held out. The order now was simple: push the Japanese back. They were not going to receive any more supplies. They were not going to get any medicine. As one soldier remembered, they tried to push east. The Japanese could not get the villagers to give them food, so they sometimes forced the villagers. The word went round, "Get out of the village if they come." The Burmese went after them. The new chaps who'd bullied them now, they started killing some of them. They were in a terrible state. On May the 11th, General Wei Li Huang began his offensive from China, adding another front to the Japanese nightmare. In mid-June, the Kohima-Imphal road was reopened. The Japanese offensive, which had been intended to knock Britain out of the war in Asia and open the gate to India, had been comprehensively broken. The Japanese 15th Army, which had crossed the Chindwin with such confidence just months before, staggered back across it as a shattered force, leaving behind a trail of dead and dying men stretching through the jungle. As one soldier observed with quiet finality, the Japanese, they were never taken prisoner. They generally killed themselves. The campaign in Burma would continue, but the threat to India was over. And the Japanese army that had seemed invincible in the jungles of Southeast Asia, the army that had conquered Malaya and Singapore, and driven the British from their richest colonial possessions, had been decisively defeated on the battlefield. The India-Burma battlefield was not the only scene of offensive action in the Asia-Pacific theater. During 1944, with the Marshall and Gilbert Islands captured and secured, Allied planning turned toward the Marianas and beyond that, the Philippines. The Japanese could read a map as well as the Americans, and they too identified the strategic significance of the Marianas. They planned to respond to the expected American assault by deploying a strong fleet in combination with aircraft based on the islands. Together, the plan proposed, they would destroy the American carrier force and turn the tide of the Pacific War. The carrier force they intended to destroy was the largest naval armada yet assembled in the Pacific. It was built around 15 carriers and supported by the Fifth Fleet, with 7 battleships and 21 cruisers. And then there was the invasion fleet, carrying 4 full divisions of troops, which included a further 12 escort carriers, 5 battleships, and 11 cruisers. The scale of American industrial power was staggering. A nation that had been caught unprepared at Pearl Harbor less than 3 years earlier had built a navy that dwarfed anything the world had ever seen. Against this overwhelming concentration of American power, Admiral Toyota had command of the fleet assembling to oppose them. He had 5 battleships and 8 carriers. The disparity was enormous, but the Japanese were betting on skill, on surprise, and on the advantage of land-based aircraft operating from the Marianas themselves. On June the 11th, the assault on the Marianas began with a bombing attack on the most northerly of the islands, Saipan. Taking it first would prevent reinforcements from reaching the garrison from Japan. Saipan was defended by 32,000 troops, and the landings were strongly opposed. Casualties were high, in part because the fleet and its air cover had to be withdrawn when the Japanese naval force was spotted, and both navies maneuvered to position themselves for what would become the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On the 19th and 20th of June, 1944, the largest carrier battle in history was fought. The Japanese initiated the action with the launch of airstrikes against the American carriers. But the incoming waves were plotted on radar long before they arrived, and what followed was less a battle than a slaughter. On that first day, the Japanese lost 219 aircraft. The Americans lost 29. 2 Japanese carriers were sunk by submarines. On the second day, the main American carrier force under Admiral Mark Mitcher attacked the Japanese fleet, sinking 1 carrier and destroying 65 more aircraft. The Americans dubbed the action the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In the final tally, the Japanese had lost 3 carriers and 480 aircraft. The Americans had lost no ships and 29 planes. The losses in material were devastating, but the losses in trained aircrew were even more significant. Japan's naval aviation had been built over decades, and the pilots who went down in the Philippine Sea could not be replaced, not with months of training, not with years. Their loss permanently and fatally weakened Japan's ability to wage war at sea, and in their desperation, the Japanese military would soon turn to a novel and terrible solution to their shortage of skilled pilots. It would be named for the divine wind that had twice in the 13th century destroyed Mongol invasion fleets, saving Japan from conquest. That wind was called kamikaze. Young men, many of them barely out of school, would be asked to fly their aircraft directly into enemy ships, trading their lives for the chance to sink a single vessel. It was a measure of how far Japan had fallen, and how far it was willing to go. Back on Saipan, the fighting ground on. On the 6th of July, the Japanese commanders on the island ordered a final suicide attack and then took their own lives. The next day, their orders were carried out. When the battle was over, 26,000 Japanese soldiers were dead. American dead totaled 3,426. But the horror did not end with the fighting. One American sailor who was present recalled what he witnessed. "We were off Saipan. We saw civilians diving off the cliffs, committing suicide with their children. The propaganda that had told them the Americans would be monsters had driven them to choose death over surrender. It was a tragedy beyond words." 10 days after the fall of Saipan, under increasing criticism for the conduct of the war, General Hideki Tojo resigned as Prime Minister of Japan. 3 days after that, the 1st U.S. Marine Division landed on Guam. On the 24th, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions landed on Tinian. Resistance on Tinian ended on August the 1st. And on Guam on the 10th, although the last Japanese soldier on Guam would not surrender until 1960. One Marine who fought on Guam carried away more than memories. "We had Guam, and I got a nice dose of malaria, 105 fever. They treated me a little bit aboard ship, but they sent me home. Believe it or not, I was sent home." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of every man who had ever heard those words. Only those that were in the service know that feeling. Hear your name, pack up, you're going home. Japan was losing the war. But the road to Tokyo was still long, and it would be paved with blood. In the European theater, Allied progress in Italy was slow and agonizingly costly. Having landed on the Italian mainland in September of 1943, Allied forces had moved north toward Rome, confronting the first of the German defensive positions, the Gustav Line. American divisions moved along the Mediterranean coast from Salerno and through Naples, while the British Eighth Army moved to link up with commandos who had landed at Termoli on the Adriatic coast. From early November, the Allies faced a formidable opponent in Field Marshal Albert Kesselring. At the end of November, Montgomery launched the Eighth Army at the Gustav Line and breached the defenses in the east. But at the beginning of 944, both Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, and Montgomery were withdrawn from Italy to concentrate on planning the invasion of Northern Europe. Their departure left a gap in leadership at a critical moment. Also in January of 1944, and despite cumulative losses of 4.5 million men, the German armed forces reached their greatest strength, 9.5 million under arms. The numbers may have misrepresented the quality of those now being conscripted to fight, but the Wehrmacht that faced General Mark Clark's U.S. Fifth Army on the western end of the Gustav Line remained a formidable enemy. On January the 22nd, in an attempt to outflank the defensive position, Operation Shingle landed the U.S. 3rd Division and the British 1st Division behind the Gustav Line at a place called Anzio. It was to become, briefly, the world's fourth busiest port, a measure of the sheer volume of men and material being poured ashore. A strong beachhead was established 24 kilometers wide and 12 deep, but the initial advantage of surprise was squandered. By the time the Allied commanders considered pushing inland, Kesselring had ordered reinforcements into the area, and 6 German divisions had moved up to contain the landing. What had been conceived as a bold flanking maneuver became a bloody siege. In mid-February, the Americans began their assault on the Gustav Line, attempting the breakthrough that would allow them to link up with forces advancing from the Anzio beachhead. Within a week, the American commander at Anzio had been replaced, a punishment for his lack of progress. The Germans continued their pressure on the beachhead in an operation they called Fish Fang, catch fish, and it was only Allied air supremacy that kept them at bay. The assault on the Gustav Line had, meanwhile, been held up at a place that would become synonymous with sacrifice and futility, Monte Cassino. From February the 2nd to May the 17th, the Allies launched 5 separate offensives against the ancient Benedictine monastery that crowned the hilltop. Founded in the 6th century by Saint Benedict himself, the monastery had stood for nearly 1,500 years. 135 American flying fortresses reduced it to rubble in a matter of hours. The decision to bomb the monastery remains one of the most controversial of the war. In the rubble, and in command of the high ground, the German paratroopers found better defensive positions than the intact building had ever provided. They repelled attempts by Indian, Canadian, British, and New Zealand formations, one bloody assault after another. Finally, General Alphonse Juin's Free French forces, led by Moroccan irregulars, skilled in mountain warfare, opened the way. It was the Polish Second Corps that carried Monte Cassino at last. On May the 17th, the Polish flag flew above the ruins as the Germans finally withdrew. One Polish soldier remembered the aftermath with the kind of detail that only those who were there could know. "With my friend, I explored the area at night, and we found German helmets, and with German helmets, we pretended to be Germans. We were questioned, and we would say, 'Yeah, all good.' And there were 12 cement bunkers, with 1 window each, from which they had been shooting. We managed to disable them by throwing grenades into the bunkers, and that's why we managed to destroy them." The Cassino front had taken the Allies 3 months for an advance of just 15 kilometers. 3 months, 5 major assaults, and thousands of lives for a stretch of ground that a man could walk in an afternoon. By late May, German divisions were being badly mauled, and Rome lay ahead. The plan called for a drive east to Valmontone, to cut off the withdrawing German 10th Army and destroy it. But Mark Clark had other ideas, rather imperial ideas, as his critics would say. His determination to be the liberator of the Eternal City, to be the first Allied general to enter Rome since Belisarius in the 6th century, led him to redirect his forces toward the capital instead. The decision allowed the German 10th Army to withdraw intact, escaping to fight another day. It was a strategic blunder that would cost lives for months to come. On June the 5th, Mark Clark led his forces into Rome. He was photographed entering the city with the bearing of a conqueror, determined to claim his place in history, but he failed to receive the publicity he had hoped for. The following day was D-Day, and the liberation of Rome was swept from the front pages by the greatest amphibious invasion in human history. It had taken the Allies 9 months to advance from toe to knee of the Italian boot, at a cost of 40,000 Allied and 25,000 German casualties. The Italian campaign would continue for another year, costly and frustrating to the end. But the world's attention was about to shift, irreversibly, to the beaches of Normandy. The spring thaw that transformed the Eastern Front into a sea of mud meant that the Russians could at last begin their offensive. On the 4th of March, they moved, but they advanced without one of their best commanders. Nikolai Vatutin, ambushed by partisans fighting for an independent Ukraine, had died of his wounds. It was a bitter irony, a general who had survived the titanic battles of Stalingrad and Kursk, killed by a guerrilla ambush behind his own lines. But the offensive would not wait for the dead. The strategic aim of the spring offensive was to drive a wedge between Army Group A and Army Group South, splitting the German defenses and opening the road west. The scale of the Soviet war machine by 1944 was something the Germans had never imagined possible. The factories beyond the Urals, relocated and rebuilt after the catastrophic losses of 1,941, were now producing tanks, aircraft, and artillery in numbers that dwarfed German output, and the men and women who crewed those machines had been hardened by 3 years of the most savage fighting in history. As one wartime broadcast captured it, at the moment, the best news comes from the Russian front, where the Red Army has been scoring one triumph after another, beating back the invaders, smashing their defenses. In the first 2 days, Zhukov's first Ukrainian front advanced 40 kilometers despite the clinging, energy-sapping mud. The momentum was unstoppable. By the end of the month, Hitler had sacked the commanders of both army groups, von Kleist and von Manstein. Walter Model and Ferdinand Schörner, lesser commanders but better Nazis, were appointed to replace them. Competence was being sacrificed on the altar of ideological loyalty, and the German army would pay the price. On April the 8th, Soviet forces advanced into the Crimea. In only 2 days, Odessa fell. On the 17th, Ternopil fell to Zhukov. Ternopil was not a well-known battle. It was not a major city. But Hitler had declared it a fortress, a Führerfestung, one of a growing number of cities and towns that the Führer designated as strongpoints to be held at all costs. And the 4,500 men of its garrison had defended it accordingly, fighting to the death as ordered. When the guns fell silent, 55 Germans had survived the assault. The rest, more than 4,000 men, were dead or captured. It was a pattern that would repeat itself across the Eastern Front as Germany retreated. Fanatical defense ordered by a man who would never see the front lines, and the men who carried out those orders paying the ultimate price for their obedience. By mid-May, with the surrender of the final 25,000 troops, the Crimea had been cleared, and Soviet attention turned to the summer to the planning of the greatest offensive of the entire war. It was given the code name Operation Bagration, named after a hero of the Napoleonic Wars. The offensive would involve over 2 million Soviet troops, nearly 6,000 tanks, and more than 30,000 artillery pieces. It was designed to shatter the German Army Group Center and open the road to Poland and, beyond it, to Berlin itself. Bagration was designed to coincide with the invasion of Western Europe. The Second Front that Stalin had been demanding since 1941 and that he had been promised would be opened in 1944 was at last about to become a reality. And when it came, the combined weight of East and West would fall on Germany simultaneously. The Reich would be caught in a vice from which there would be no escape. The war's final act was being set in motion on 2 fronts at once, and the men who would execute it were already in position, waiting for the order to advance. The planning for the Second Front had been underway since April of 1943. Hundreds and hundreds of men and women, without the help of a single computer or calculator or mobile telephone, planned the logistics that would deliver, support, supply, and reinforce an immense invasion force, shipped across 35 kilometers of unpredictable sea and landed on defended beaches. Their work involved masses of men and material, and it depended utterly on secrecy. A single leak, a captured document, a careless word overheard in a pub, any one of these could unravel the entire operation. The fate of millions rested on the ability to keep a secret that was known by tens of thousands. All sorts of deceptions were employed. The British Fourth Army in Scotland drew German units north, but there was no Fourth Army. Patton's First Army, based in the southeast, was a clear threat to the Channel ports, but there was no First American Army under Patton. For every bomb dropped on Normandy, 3 were dropped elsewhere to obscure the true target. The Germans were heavily dependent on intelligence received from their agents in the United Kingdom, but by D-Day, every single one of their agents had been turned and was supplying Germany with false information. The deception was total. The greater part of the south coast region of England, to a depth of 16 kilometers, was declared a military zone. Villages were evacuated. The invasion was practiced again and again. Eisenhower, in supreme command, had an Anglo-American team of meteorologists to advise him, and they warned against the 5th of June, the original date, but gave a cautious go-ahead for the 6th. And so Eisenhower gave the order for the invasion. It was headed, as the communiqué would say, by the words, "The tide has turned." Eisenhower himself was less certain. "I hope to God," he said, "I know what I'm doing." The men who would cross the channel that night remembered the final hours in their own ways. One recalled, "We were just waiting, loading and unloading. When we started to load tanks, that's when we said, 'This is it.'" Another remembered the atmosphere of uncertainty. There wasn't anything mentioned as far as going for an invasion, but there were a lot of ships. A third was more matter of fact. "We didn't know much about it prior to the few days before D-Day, except that we knew we were going to invade France. We had photographs of our targets on the beach at Juno and all the rest of it. And then, there was the mundane reality of war, the small absurdities that no planner could account for. The only thing we got to eat on the way over was this new stuff, a self-heating soup. Most men ate it, so the bottom got red hot, and all those vegetables got burned, and the top was cold. There were all sorts of things like that that went wrong. War, even on the eve of its greatest operation, was still a profoundly human affair. But for all the small mishaps, the scale of the organization was breathtaking. One soldier marveled at it. "I was amazed at the efficiency of it all. We were told which number landing craft we would be on. So we were going down past hundreds and hundreds of vehicles. They said, 'You're on landing craft 59. No hope of that, I thought. But in fact, as we got there, in comes landing craft 59. It was quite extraordinarily efficient. Facing the invasion, in overall command, was Field Marshal von Rundstedt. In command of the forces directly opposing the landing, Army Group B, was Erwin Rommel. Though on D-Day itself, Rommel was absent, on leave. It was his wife's birthday. There were 850,000 men in von Rundstedt's command, and amongst them, choosing to fight as soldiers rather than die as prisoners, were 60,000 Russians. The Germans had fewer tanks for the defense of France in 1944, than they had marshaled for its conquest in 1940. But they had the fortified Atlantic Wall, which had been Hitler's idea and which extended over 2,000 kilometers, boasting 12,000 bunkers. 2 million slave laborers had worked for 2 years to build it. Much of its weaponry had been stripped and shipped from the Maginot Line, the French fortification system that had failed to stop the Germans in 1940, now repurposed to try to stop the Allies in 1944. It was an impressive feat of engineering. But a wall is only as strong as the men who defend it, and many of the divisions manning the Atlantic Wall were second-rate formations, undermanned and under-equipped. The invasion armada that would test those defenses was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It comprised 700 warships, whose role was both air defense and shore bombardment. 2,700 ships supported the landing, carrying the supplies, the reinforcements, and the infrastructure, fuel pipelines and floating mulberry harbors that would make the landing sustainable. And there were 2,500 landing craft. Each of the ship's captains received a book with 700 pages of instructions. Above them, the Allied air forces flew thousands of aircraft. The Germans could meet them with only 170 serviceable machines. The imbalance in the air was total, and it would prove decisive. A total of 3 million Allied personnel were involved in the effort, a number so large that it defies easy comprehension. Those who saw the Armada never forgot it. 5,000 ships, all gathering together to make the invasion into Normandy, one man recalled. It was a sight to see on the horizon. Seeing all these ships, they looked like little dots getting bigger and bigger, and then merging into Normandy Beach. Another put it simply, anybody who was there will say the ships, the aircraft, you would never, ever forget it. A sailor crossing in the convoy remembered the strange intimacy of it. There were so many landing craft. Sailors were all talking to each other by semaphore, just using their arms. They were all so close together they could talk to other craft. And there were those for whom the crossing was less romantic. It was very rough. There's no cover in the landing craft. You're just lying on the deck. I was extremely sick and spent most of the time praying that the Germans would come and sink us. The invaders landed on a 90-kilometer stretch of 5 beaches along the Normandy coast. The names given to those beaches by the planners are an indestructible part of the history of the war words that would be carved into monuments and repeated in classrooms and remembered by generations who never saw a shot fired. Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juneau, Sword. The 21st Army Group, under General Montgomery, sailed from ports along the British coast, the U.S. First Army under General Bradley would land on Utah and Omaha beaches. The British Second Army under General Dempsey would land on Gold, Juno, and Sword. The U.S. 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions landed behind Utah. The British 6th Airborne landed behind Sword. It was calculated that of the airborne troops dropped on the night of June the 5th into the 6th, up to 75%, scattered across the countryside and landing at the wrong locations, took no part in the early fighting. In the darkness, in fields and hedgerows and flooded marshes, thousands of paratroopers struggled simply to find each other. Rommel had 34 divisions opposing the landing, but many were facing the wrong direction. Most were under strength, and some were feeble units comprising exclusively men with stomach complaints. 5 Allied divisions came ashore that morning. The 1st, the U.S. 4th Infantry Division landed 1,800 meters from its target due to a strong current, but the current swept it to a weakly defended position. The 4th landed 23,000 men on D-Day and took only 197 casualties. It was a very different story on Omaha, the beach that would become the most iconic and the most feared name in the history of the invasion. One soldier remembered, "We couldn't hit Omaha Beach in its entirety, so we had to lower the ramp as much as we could, and everybody had to go into the water. A lot of the people with gear went down, and some of them perished because of the gear. Men drowned under the weight of their own equipment, pulled beneath the waves before they ever reached the sand." Omaha Beach was dominated by cliffs, from which, for much of the day, the U.S. 1st and 29th Divisions were pinned by intense and accurate fire. The swimming tanks, designed to provide armored support from the moment of landing, had been launched prematurely in heavy seas, and many foundered, leaving the infantry without any cover at all. For hours, the outcome on Omaha hung in the balance. By day's end, 55,000 men had been landed, but at a cost of more than 4,600 casualties. The sand was stained red, and the bodies of the dead rocked gently in the surf. The third beach, from left to right, was Gold, where the British 50th Division landed, supported by the 8th Armored Brigade. One soldier who waded ashore that morning remembered every step. "I got to the water, got chest deep, and I got out of the water onto the sand. I'd only gone about 3 or 4 paces when my number 2 went down alongside me, and the blood was spitting out. I went down. 'Come on, Charlie, come on!' Somebody screamed at me, 'Get off the beach! Get off the beach!' He didn't have to tell me I was on my way anyway." He paused and added quietly, "But you can't just leave a mate." The 3rd Canadian Division landed on Juno, where it met particular difficulty with underwater obstacles and rough water. By nightfall, it had made contact with the British 50th on its right. The final beach was Sword, where the British 3rd Division landed successfully. But success on the beach was only the beginning. One soldier remembered the men who made it possible. Amongst all that, there were Navy chaps standing there directing everybody off the beach. Get off the beach, off you go." There was one of them, and he was looking at his shoulder in a stupid sort of way. There were bits of his arm flying off as the bullets hit him. He was taking a full burst in his shoulder, and he was just looking at it. He shook his head. God knows how many men they lost in that way. The general confusion, the mass of men and machines, and the contrasting levels of success created an opportunity for the defenders. The 21st Panzer Division took a firm grip on Caen, denying it to the Allies for whom it had been a D-Day objective. One soldier remembered the fight to push inland. "The first job was to take the blockhouse, and then we crossed the minefield. We'd been given 3 tanks just for the landing to cut the wire. They lasted 5 minutes, I believe. One after the other, bang, 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 were hit. The Germans had the 88, and the 88 was a tremendous weapon. As June the 6th wore on, units began to extend the perimeter away from the beaches, short of the proposed target line, but beginning to move into the villages on or behind the coast. For many soldiers, the transition from the carnage of the beach to the quiet of a Norman village was disorienting. One soldier's experience captured the strange juxtaposition of violence and the mundane with almost comic vividness. "Get off the beach as fast as you can and turn right at the little road that you come across, and eventually you'll see the church and make your own way there through the streets." So I went up to the door, took the Sten gun out, and aimed at the lock John Wayne fashion bang. Sure, I fired that shot. Then there's a tap on my shoulder, I turned around, and there's this man dressed in black, the parish priest, shaking his head. He walked over, turned the handle, and it opened. I walked in as humble as anything, both complete and utterly humiliated. Even on the longest day, the war could still make a man feel foolish. It was late afternoon before Hitler gave permission for the deployment of 2 panzer divisions that had been held in reserve. The delay was catastrophic. Had those divisions been unleashed at dawn, the story of D-Day might have been very different. But Hitler, convinced that Normandy was a diversion and that the real invasion would come at the Pas de Calais, hesitated, and in war, hesitation kills. By the end of June the 6th, he was still not fully convinced that the Normandy landing was the real invasion rather than a feint. But it was no feint. By the end of the first day, the Allies were short of their target line along almost the whole length of the invasion front. Not a single D-Day objective had been fully achieved. Caen, which was supposed to fall on the first day, would hold out for weeks, but none of that mattered, not yet. What mattered was that the Allies had 156,000 men ashore, established ashore, supported ashore. They had control of the sky. Naval support was unchallenged, meaning that reinforcement and resupply would be unhindered. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had boasted would repel any invasion, had been breached in a single day. It had not been a walk in the park. Thousands of young men lay dead on the beaches and in the fields behind them, but the beachhead was secure. The door to Europe was open, and it would never be closed again. In only 3 weeks, the Allies would land 800,000 troops. They would break out from Normandy and begin to roll back the German conquests. The second front was open at last. The war was not over. The hardest fighting in many theaters was still to come. In the next chapter of The Price of Empire, the Allies move out of the Normandy beachhead and begin the advance that will carry them across the Rhine. The Soviet Union launches Operation Bagration and begins the offensive that will carry it to Berlin. And in Asia, the Philippines fall, and Allied troops step onto Japanese soil for the first time. 16.5 meters below the Chancellery Garden in Berlin, a man celebrates his 56th birthday while his empire burns above him. The searchlights have already turned against German positions. The guns, 8,983 of them, have already opened fire. More than 6 million soldiers of the Red Army are already moving, racing each other for the ultimate prize. But Adolf Hitler doesn't know the full truth yet. He decorates members of the Hitler Youth for bravery, their faces still bearing the softness of childhood. Then he descends into the Führer bunker for the last time. Above him, up to 10,000 Germans hang from lampposts, executed for defeatism. Around him, 200 Soviet divisions close in on 50 indifferent German divisions that stand no chance. The Red Army is already 200 meters away. What began in September 1939, with Germany's invasion of Poland, what became global on the 7th of December, 1941, when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, what touched every continent and lasted 6 years, now approaches its terrible climax. This is not just the story of how Berlin fell. This is the story of how the world changed forever in the span of 6 months, from March to August 1945, when humanity ended one age and entered another with a weapon so devastating that its very existence redefined what war could mean. The final chapter of the Second World War unfolds across 2 hemispheres, 2 completely different kinds of warfare, and one unprecedented decision that still reverberates today. You're about to witness the collapse of the Third Reich, where German soldiers are given an impossible choice between the Americans racing from the West and the Soviets scorching the earth from the east. You'll see the brutal mathematics of Okinawa, where casualty projections will force American commanders to contemplate something unthinkable. This is the story of 325,000 prisoners taken in a single pocket, of 80,000 rape survivors in one city alone, of a decision made in the knowledge that a blast generating 300,000 degrees Celsius could change everything, of empire builders who conquered for trade, resources, and a cultural conceit that they were superior only to pay a price measured not just in money, but in values that have nothing to do with currency. The greatest man-made event in history was about to reach its conclusion, but the ending, no one expected, would cost more than anyone imagined. By the 28th of March 1945, the outcome is no longer in question. The defeat of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich is inevitable. What remains is the brutal arithmetic of how many will die before the mathematics of war finally equals zero. The war that began with Japan's invasion of China in 1937, that reached Europe when German tanks rolled into Poland, that became truly global when bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, has ravaged every continent for years. Now, in the spring of 1945, the Grand Alliance, Britain, America, and the Soviet Union, converges on Germany from all directions. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower makes a decision that will shape the post-war world. Acting on his own initiative, he advises Soviet leadership that his troops will advance on the line Erfurt-Leipzig-Dresden. He makes it clear, Berlin is not his objective. Stalin is delighted. He replies that he too regards Berlin as of no consequence. It's a lie, of course. Berlin is everything. Churchill is appalled. The British Prime Minister argues that the post-war settlement demands the Allies meet the Russians as far east as possible. But Churchill's influence, Britain's influence, is waning. The world is being reordered, and the old imperial power that once painted the map red finds itself increasingly sidelined in decisions about Europe's future. On March 28, 3 army groups begin their movement. The British Second Army moves from its bridgehead at Wesel. The U.S. First and Third trap the German 89th Corps around Gießen. 4 days later, the U.S. 9th links with the 1st at Lippstadt. In little over 3 weeks, they will make contact with the Red Army. Meanwhile, the forces defending Germany face impossible odds. The resources are far from elite. West of Berlin, the 12th Army comprises 12 divisions, a grab bag of raw recruits, misfits, leftovers, and veterans thrown together in desperation. North of the city, von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army comprises 9 divisions, none of which is actually panzer. The total deployed in defense of the capital, some 50 in different divisions. Coming toward them, almost 200 divisions of the Red Army, and as they come on, they scorch the earth. On April 15, the Ruhr pocket is cut in two. Field Marshal Walter Model receives an invitation to surrender. His response reveals the impossible position of German commanders in the war's final days. Model replies that he is bound by his oath to Adolf Hitler, and a formal surrender is out of the question. Instead, he dissolves his army group. The numbers are staggering. 325,000 German troops are taken prisoner in this single encirclement. It's one of the largest mass captures in military history, and it happens in the span of days. On April 20, the propaganda ministry in Berlin publicly denounces Army Group B as traitors. Model, who knows the Soviets have indicted him for war crimes, makes his final choice. He shoots himself in the head. The same month brings more symbolic losses. Nuremberg, so deeply symbolic of Nazism, the city where Hitler staged his massive rallies, falls to General Patch's 7th U.S. Army. American forces cross the Danube. On April 25, American and Soviet troops make contact for the first time. On the same day, the Red Army completes its encirclement of Berlin. Hitler declares that Berlin will be a fortress. Defensive preparations are made in depth, but everyone knows the truth. The resources simply aren't there. What remains is the waiting, and what's coming is terrible. The Soviet offensive is designed to ensure the fall of Berlin no later than May Day, the 1st of May, a deadline written in blood. Soviet forces begin to move on April 12. On April 15, Hitler issues a special order of the day for the last time. The language reveals the ideology that drove the entire catastrophe. Our deadly enemies, the Jewish Bolsheviks, have launched their massive forces to the attack. The order claims that if every soldier does his duty, the last assault of Asia will crumple, and Europe will never be Russian. Then comes the moment that changes everything. 8,983 Soviet guns open fire. More than 6 million men and women of the Red Army begin to move. 3 fronts race each other for the prize. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian front in the center, Konev's 1st Ukrainian front to the south, Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian to the north. They compete not just against the Germans, but against each other for the glory of taking Berlin. Zhukov's offensive begins with a dramatic innovation. 140 searchlights, operated by female soldiers, are turned on directly in the eyes of the enemy. It's meant to blind and disorient. But when the assault begins, the front line is found to be mostly deserted. The Germans have pulled back, refusing to be caught in the initial bombardment. What they didn't know was that this tactical retreat would only delay the inevitable by days. Inside the city, the atmosphere turns medieval. Up to 10,000 Germans are hanged for defeatism, many from lampposts in public squares. The message is clear: there will be no retreat, no surrender, no escape. April 20 arrives, Hitler's 56th birthday. He emerges briefly from his bunker to decorate members of the Hitler Youth for bravery. Children, boys who should be in school, are instead being given medals for fighting Soviet tanks. After this final public appearance, Hitler descends into the Führer bunker 16.5 meters below the Chancellery Garden for the last time. The walls are closing in, literally and figuratively. On April 28, Hitler learns two pieces of information that shatter what remains of his world. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, has been conducting armistice negotiations in Italy behind his back. Reichsmarshal Göring, who slipped away to the south, signals Hitler that since the Führer is trapped in Berlin, perhaps he should take control of the German state. The betrayals from his closest associates hit Hitler like physical blows. He orders both Göring and Himmler stripped of their rank and arrested. But there's more immediate treachery to address. SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein is caught attempting to slip out of Berlin in civilian clothes. Hitler orders him shot. The execution is carried out immediately. Then Hitler makes his final preparations. He marries Fegelein's sister-in-law, Eva Braun, in a brief ceremony in the bunker. He draws up his last will and political testament. The document is revealing: "I desire to share the fate that millions of others have taken upon themselves, in that I shall remain in this city. Furthermore, I do not want to fall into the hands of enemies who, for the delectation of the hate-riddled masses, require a new spectacle promoted by the Jews." Even at the end, the ideology that drove everything remains unchanged. April 30 arrives. The Red Army is now 200 meters away. Artillery shells shake the bunker with each impact. Hitler conducts one final test. He successfully poisons his beloved dog, Blondie, with cyanide to ensure the poison works. Then Adolf Hitler and his new bride of less than 40 hours bite down on cyanide capsules. To be absolutely certain, Hitler simultaneously shoots himself in the temple. The German wireless broadcasts interrupt regular programming. "Serious, important news," says the announcer. Bruckner's 7th Symphony begins to play the same music that accompanied the announcement of Stalingrad's fall. The solemn voice continues: "It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism, fell for Germany this afternoon in his operational headquarters. 200 meters away, Soviet soldiers fight street by street, room by room, meter by meter through the devastated capital. Joseph Goebbels and his wife make their own terrible decision. Mrs. Goebbels murders their 6 children. Then she and her husband commit suicide. The next day, the Reichstag falls. The red flag is famously hoisted on its roof, one of the most iconic images of the war's end. General Helmut Weidling, commanding the military garrison, surrenders the city. The battle for Berlin has cost more than 300,000 Soviet casualties. German casualties are perhaps similar in number. An additional 480,000 German prisoners are taken, soldiers who failed in their desperate attempt to break out westward, to surrender to American, British, and French forces from whom they expected kinder treatment. What they didn't know was what awaited them in Soviet captivity. Everywhere that men make war, there is a tragic toll of brutalized, raped, and murdered women. Not even the most inspired apologist can suggest these victims were paying for crimes they had committed. Germany maintained 500 military brothels during the war. As the Red Army surges into Berlin, it is estimated that 80,000 women survive rape. 10,000 rape victims die, many by suicide. The figures are predictably disputed, but the suffering is undeniable. By early May, members of the Grand Alliance are making contact all along the front. Montgomery's forces meet Rokossovsky's on the line Wismar-Wittenberg. On May 4, Montgomery receives the unconditional surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. On May 7, the Germans sign the unconditional surrender. By this time, all of Germany's Axis partners except one have already changed sides. Hungary, Romania, Italy, all are now fighting with the Allies. Only Japan remains to oppose the United Nations. Churchill and Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, are ready to declare May 7, Victory in Europe Day, but their Soviet allies insist on a separate surrender ceremony in Moscow. VE Day becomes May 8. The war in the West is over. Prisoners of war are liberated. One survivor remembers, "We're in this camp, and suddenly a tank appeared. The tank turned round and went down to the far corner of the camp barrier and smashed the whole thing to the ground. The turret opened, and I saw a Brit, I think it was a Brit, stood up and waved to us. That was the end of the war for us." Jewish people who had been hidden for years by brave countrymen can finally show their faces. One recalls the moment of parting. Young Rozier went to his little money box and took out 100 guilders for me. He said to me, "Take the train or the bus or whatever you need, and don't forget to write." And so write I did, all my life. 160,000 collaborators are arrested across Europe. 1,000 are executed. Most of those who served simply go home. One veteran remembers, "Marvelous feeling of joy, really. It had been a very long slog, so it wasn't a sort of tremendous celebration. We just rather said, 'Thank God that's over.' That was rather the feeling. But the war isn't over. Not really. While Europe celebrates peace, the war in the East continues with unrelenting fury. In March, a firebomb raid on Tokyo killed 87,793 people and destroyed 38 square kilometers of the city. The numbers reveal the scale of destruction that has become routine in the Pacific theater. On April 1, American forces land on Okinawa, the largest of the Ryukyu Islands. The archipelago stretches from Taiwan to the most southerly of the main home islands, Kyushu. For the invasion, 430 assault transports are loaded at 11 ports from Seattle to Leyte. On April 1, 1,300 ships mass offshore, and 50,000 men of General Simon Bolivar Buckner's 10th Army go ashore against very little opposition. What they don't know is that General Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, has concentrated his force south of the Shuri Line. He's waiting, he's prepared, and he's about to unleash something that will redefine naval warfare. Just minutes after 4 o'clock in the morning, one sailor is preparing for watch. "I was going on watch, 4 o'clock watch in the morning to 8. When you stand a watch, they come and call you because you can't get the wrong clocks. You better make that watch or you're in big trouble." Then they hit. Just minutes after 4 o'clock, they hit the superstructure. Everything went blank. We were hit. Machinery after machinery went down. Forward was still good. Over the next few days, the Japanese launch kamikaze assaults on the invasion fleet. The suicide attacks don't relent throughout all the weeks of fighting that lie ahead. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the suicides of 1,465 kamikaze pilots account for 29 ships sunk, 120 damaged, and 3,048 sailors killed. One American gunner grapples with what this kind of warfare means. "It was a common cause. He took us out. We found his body with a parachute. Couldn't understand why he had a parachute, because if he was going to commit suicide, what's the answer to that?" Years later, the moral weight settles differently. "I would tell you this, and this is hard for me to tell you. He did his job, and he did it well. I fired on planes. I don't know if I hit a plane, because when you're firing, shells light up everywhere. Planes do go down, but who did it? You don't know." In time, as I got older, I realized he didn't mean it personally. He did a job. On April 9th, American invasion forces opened their main offensive against the well-planned fortifications of the Shuri Line. The fighting is terrible and progress is slow. North of the line, Okinawa is cleared with little real opposition. The Motobu Peninsula is secured by April 20. But south of the line, it's a different story. It's deep into May before Japanese resistance breaks. The capital, Naha, falls on May 27. Shuri Castle, key to the defensive line, falls on May 29. On June 18, with the battle almost won, General Buckner is killed by the effects of a shell exploding overhead. He becomes the highest-ranking American killed in action during the war. Then something unexpected happens. To the surprise of Americans who hadn't seen it elsewhere in the Pacific, Japanese soldiers begin to surrender as their morale collapses. On June 22, General Ushijima commits suicide. The casualty lists are catastrophic. Japanese casualties exceed 110,000. American casualties reach 40,000 inches battle, with nearly 10,000 more lost to kamikaze attacks. One veteran carries the weight decades later. It hurts you as you get older. Your memory is not pleasant. I don't blame anybody, but people don't know your problem. I have to excuse myself because I'm usually a jolly fellow, a fairly wise guy. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world, the leaders of the Grand Alliance meet at Potsdam, but the familiar faces have changed. Harry S. Truman is now President of the United States, and by the time the conference adjourns in July, Winston Churchill will be missing from the lineup. The 1945 election dumps Churchill and his party in a landslide. Clement Attlee sums up the situation. The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions. The agreement reached at Potsdam is the last between members of the Grand Coalition. They divide influence in Europe. The consequences will be described less than a year later by Winston Churchill himself. An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. And he might have added the cities of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states' territories that hadn't always been part of the Russian Empire. At Potsdam, the leaders face the opportunity to create a peace based on compassion and cooperation. Instead, they replace World War with Cold War. But their immediate priority is securing the Soviet Union's agreement to enter the war against Japan. The price they're prepared to pay: temporary occupation of the countries of Eastern Europe. That temporary occupation will continue until 1990. Potsdam issues a demand for Japan to surrender. The declaration warns that the alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction. The words are composed in the knowledge of something the Japanese don't know. Something that happened on July 16, something that changes everything. At Alamogordo, New Mexico, the first atomic bomb has been successfully detonated. Among the scientists working on the project are 8 refugees from Nazi persecution. When leading scientist Robert J. Oppenheimer sees the blast, he recalls a verse from a Hindu sacred book: "If the light of 1,000 suns were to rise in the sky at once." But what they didn't know, what no one fully understood, was that the Okinawa casualty figures were about to reshape the entire strategic calculus. American projections based on Okinawa estimate that taking Kyushu, the first of the home islands, will cause 268,000 American casualties. That's double the total battlefield deaths America has suffered in the entire war to date. The figure weighs heavily in the debate that will resolve the next phase of the war. The decision whether to use this new superbomb rests with one man, Commander-in-Chief Harry S. Truman. Truman orders that the first special bomb be dropped as soon as conditions allow in early August. On August 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay carries Little Boy to 9,600 meters above a city that has no idea what's coming. The bomb is designed not to blow a city up, but to knock it down. It detonates 575 meters above Hiroshima, generating a blast of 300,000 degrees Celsius for 100,000th of a second. 100,000 are killed instantly. Another 100,000 are doomed. Harry Truman calls it the greatest thing in history, though no one really knows whether it will shorten the war. But Japan doesn't respond to the Potsdam Declaration. There is only silence. So Truman orders the second attack. On August 9, Fat Boy detonates over Nagasaki. According to the Americans, 35,000 are killed. According to authorities in Nagasaki, the number is 74,800. And on the very same day that Nagasaki is bombed, something else happens that will prove equally decisive. The Trans-Baikal and Second Far East fronts of the Red Army invade Manchuria. The First Far East Front moves from Vladivostok. What the Japanese leadership doesn't yet fully grasp is that they now face annihilation from 2 directions, and they must decide which terrifies them more: atomic fire from the sky or the Red Army on their doorstep. The Supreme Council for the Conduct of the War meets in Tokyo on August 9. There is bitter conflict between those arguing for peace and the war party. But the clock is ticking, the world is watching, and the decision that comes next will determine whether Japan survives at all and what that survival will cost. The Supreme Council for the Conduct of the War sits in Tokyo on the 9th of August, 1945. Nagasaki still smolders. The Red Army pours into Manchuria, and Japan's leadership faces bitter conflict between those arguing for peace and the war party determined to fight to the last. What they don't fully understand yet is that the choice has already been made for them. The forces converging on Japan, atomic fire from the sky, and the Red Army from the continent have created an equation with only one solution. But it's the Soviet invasion, rather than Hiroshima, that forces the issue. The debate rages through the night, and the decision that emerges will reshape Asia and determine the fate of millions still under Japanese occupation. On August 10, the day after the Soviet invasion begins sweeping through Manchuria, Japan sends a Morse code signal. The message carries the weight of empires collapsing. They accept the Potsdam demands, subject only to there being nothing which would compromise the role and sovereignty of the emperor. It's a conditional surrender, the first crack in the war party's absolute resistance. On August 11, Japan receives the Allied reply. The waiting begins. 2 days pass. Each hour, more Soviet soldiers pour into Manchuria. Each hour, the possibility of a third atomic bomb hangs in the air. On August 14, Emperor Hirohito makes his decision. He orders acceptance of the terms and records, a message to be broadcast to his people the next day. His subjects have never heard his voice. For more than 2,600 years of imperial mythology, the emperor has been a divine figure beyond the realm of common human speech. Now they will hear Hirohito speak words that shatter their entire worldview. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He tells them in the formal, archaic language of the court. Therefore, our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. Hirohito doesn't explain what the joint declaration actually is. When he finishes speaking, a popular announcer comes on air to clarify what the emperor's words mean. The war is over. People go home and wait. Fear grips the nation. When polled after the war, only 4% of Japanese believe they will be humanely treated. The other 96% believe what their government has told them throughout the war, that all they can expect is starvation, torture, and death at the hands of the conquerors. Meanwhile, in Manchuria, the Soviet offensive continues without pause. During the campaign, the Soviet Union takes 674,000 Japanese prisoners. Only half will survive their captivity. Of the Japanese civilians who had settled in Manchuria, promised fresh virgin plains ready to welcome armies of migrants, 67,000 starved to death. Another 11,000 die at the hands of vengeful Chinese who remember years of brutal occupation. The human cost of empire comes due in full. On August 28, shortly after dawn, 45 C-47 transports touch down at Atsugi Air Base. U.S. Colonel Charles Tench steps onto the tarmac. He is the first conqueror ever to set foot on Japanese soil in the nation's recorded history. The symbolism is absolute. For thousands of years, Japan remained unconquered. Now, American boots walk on sacred ground. What the Japanese don't know is that the Americans are just as nervous. Tench and his men half expect resistance, kamikaze attacks, assassination attempts. But there is only silence, stillness, the shock of the defeated. September 2 arrives. 6 years and 1 day after Hitler launched his invasion of Poland, the formal ceremony takes place on the deck of the USS Missouri. General MacArthur calls forward 2 men to stand at his shoulder. General Wainwright, who surrendered his command in the Philippines after the Bataan Death March, and General Percival, who surrendered his command in Singapore. Both men endured years of brutal captivity. Both men believed they might never see this day. Now they stand as witnesses to Imperial Japan's unconditional surrender. The war in the East is over after 8 years of fighting. The Japanese release all of their Chinese prisoners of war, all 56 of them. The number is staggering in its revelation. Of the hundreds of thousands of Chinese soldiers captured during 8 years of warfare, only 56 survived to be released. The mathematics of atrocity speak louder than any testimony. Allied prisoners of war who survived are liberated. One Australian sailor remembers, 4 corvettes of the Australian Navy entered the harbor. I can still see them coming. By this time, there was only 101 of us left. I was on this ship coming home. We heard Bing Crosby singing, "Don't fence me in." I kid you not. The absurdity of survival. The strange grace of small moments. A popular song becoming the anthem of freedom. Those who fought can finally go home. One American veteran recalls the moment. I got off the trolley car with my big duffel bag on my back in my Army uniform. I'd been away for 2 years. Here is my sister with her newborn baby, and my little dog pulls away from her and comes running up the block. My sister is screaming, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry." She's never done that. My dog is a good dog, and the dog is running, and he's all over me, and I'm crying in tears. She didn't know it was me till she got within like 5 feet. My little dog knew me. The recognition, the homecoming, the tears, but the reckoning is only beginning. The greatest man-made event in history was a war of such colossal proportion that the cost in money is hard to comprehend. The tally in human life is even more difficult. The mathematics of death reshape how we understand what happened. For every 2 people that the United States lost in the war, Britain, her Commonwealth and Empire, lost 3. The Japanese lost 12. The Germans lost 22. The Soviet Union lost 184. Let that number settle. For every 2 Americans who died, 184 Soviets perished. The aggregate figure of 27 million dead for the Soviet Union is probably the best guess. For China, more than 20 million died. No one can accurately calculate the final death toll, but it is surely dwarfed by the total of lives not lost but permanently affected by a war which can never be understood in statistics. One veteran speaks for millions. I don't speak for the army or what I was involved with. I just gave you the general outlook of how we progressed. But the individual fighting, the hand-to-hand combat that is war. That is war. The personal cost cannot be quantified. The trauma doesn't appear in casualty lists. The nightmares don't show up in after-action reports. Meanwhile, the map of the world transforms before everyone's eyes. For so long, the display of colors defined this or that nation's sovereignty over others. The map was a testament to empire, vast swaths of red for the British Empire, different shades marking French, Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish possessions. Now the map becomes a great patchwork. The vast land empires are no more. The great maritime empires, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, Britain, all begin their retreat. But why? What happened? Empires are acquired, conquered for trade, resources, territory, and because of a conceit common to all empire builders, the belief that their cultural and political DNA is superior, that they are right to dominate other societies. The Second World War was driven by such conceits. 2 imperial dreams drove their people into catastrophic war. The Japanese Empire expanded violently across Asia. The German Empire expanded violently across Europe. Both collapsed. Both went bankrupt financially, morally, spiritually, and their collapse sounded the death knell of the old imperial system. The price of empire can be expressed in monetary terms, but the true price involves values that have nothing to do with money. The enormous convulsion of the Second World War, infected as it was in every part by the bacillus of racism, allowed people to see something fundamental. Independence and identity are incorruptible values. A Roman historian named Tacitus wrote 2,000 years ago about the nature of conquest. They plunder, they slaughter, they steal these things, they misname empire, they make a desert and call it peace. Those words echo across the centuries into 1945. Those who could have been embraced as liberators were loathed as conquerors. They misnamed their conquests empire, and they paid the price. In Europe, the Iron Curtain descends across the continent. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, Sofia, all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe fall behind that line. The cities of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, which had not always been part of the Russian Empire, now become part of a Soviet sphere that will last 45 years. The temporary occupation agreed to at Potsdam becomes permanent. The Grand Alliance fractures. World War gives way to Cold War almost immediately. The atomic bomb changes the calculus of everything. The knowledge that humanity now possesses the power to generate 300,000 degrees Celsius to create the light of 1,000 suns rising at once fundamentally alters what war can mean. The next global conflict cannot be fought the way this one was, because the next global conflict could end civilization itself. In Asia, the collapse of Japanese empire creates a vacuum. Korea, occupied since 1910, splits into competing zones. China, devastated by 8 years of war against Japan and years of civil war before that, faces a new struggle between nationalist and communist forces. Vietnam, Burma, Malaya, Indonesia, all the territories held by European powers before Japan's occupation, now demand independence. The old order cannot be restored. The colonial powers discover that you cannot ask people to fight for freedom against fascism and then deny them freedom when the war ends. The contradiction is too blatant, too obvious. The British Empire begins its withdrawal from India, the jewel in the crown. The Dutch face revolution in the East Indies. The French face resistance in Indochina. The Portuguese and Spanish empires, already diminished, continue their long decline. What none of the empire builders anticipated was that the very tools they used to maintain control, education, infrastructure, communication would become the instruments of their empire's dissolution. The educated elites they trained would lead independence movements. The railways they built would carry revolutionaries. The telegraph systems would coordinate resistance. The enormous convulsion of the war infected everything with the understanding that independence and identity have value beyond economic calculation. You cannot measure in currency the worth of self-determination. You cannot price the dignity of sovereignty. One survivor reflects on the experience of coming home after the war ended. "We came home and lived happily ever after." It's a simple statement, almost naive in its optimism, but it contains a truth that the empire builders never grasped. Ordinary people don't want empire. They want to live. They want to come home. They want the freedom to build lives on their own terms. The Japanese government, in its propaganda, had told its people they faced starvation, torture, and death if they surrendered. When 96% of the population believed this lie, it revealed something profound about the nature of the regime. A government that maintains power through terror and mythology cannot survive contact with reality. When Colonel Tench stepped onto Japanese soil, the first conqueror in recorded history, and the expected resistance didn't materialize, it demonstrated that the mythology of empire was always more fragile than it appeared. The divine right of the emperor, the invincibility of the warrior culture, the superiority of Japanese civilization, all of it collapsed when confronted with defeat. Similarly, when the Red Army entered Berlin and raised the red flag over the Reichstag, it proved that the 1,000-year Reich lasted exactly 12 years. The racial theories that drove Nazi ideology, the belief in Aryan supremacy, the vision of German dominance all vanished in the rubble of Berlin. The 325,000 German prisoners taken in the Ruhr pocket, the 480,000 taken at Berlin, the 674,000 Japanese taken in Manchuria, these numbers represent the complete collapse of military systems that claim to be invincible. The Wehrmacht that conquered Europe in months couldn't defend its own capital. The Imperial Japanese Army that terrorized Asia for 8 years surrendered without defending the home islands. The human cost of these imperial dreams is almost incomprehensible. The 80,000 rape survivors in Berlin alone, the 10,000 who died by suicide, the 67,000 Japanese civilians who starved in Manchuria, the 11,000 killed by vengeful Chinese, the 87,793 killed in a single firebomb raid on Tokyo, the 100,000 killed instantly at Hiroshima, with another 100,000 doomed, the 74,800 killed at Nagasaki according to Japanese authorities. Each number represents individual human beings, individual lives, individual stories that will never be told. The casualty ratios reveal which nations paid the highest price. The Soviet Union's 27 million dead, China's 20 million. The disproportion is staggering. The nations that suffered German and Japanese invasion paid costs far beyond those of the invaders. And yet, the invaders also paid catastrophically. The Germans lost 22 people for every 2 Americans killed. Japan lost 12 for every 2. The imperial dreams cost the empire builders more than they could afford, and far more than they anticipated. Field Marshal Walter Model, bound by his oath to Hitler, unable to surrender formally, dissolving his army group and then shooting himself. His death symbolizes the bankruptcy of the system. When loyalty to a leader requires suicide rather than common sense, the system has already failed. Hitler himself, testing poison on his dog before taking his own life, marrying Eva Braun hours before their joint suicide, dictating a final testament that blamed everyone else. His end reveals the hollowness at the core of Nazi ideology. There was no glorious last stand, no heroic sacrifice, just a man in a bunker, 200 meters from Soviet soldiers, taking poison and shooting himself. The symbolism of the surrenders tells its own story. Montgomery receiving the surrender of German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands on May 4. The formal German surrender on May 7, with the Soviets insisting on a separate ceremony in Moscow, MacArthur accepting Japan's surrender on the deck of the Missouri with Wainwright and Percival at his shoulder. The victors controlled the narrative, they controlled the symbolism, they controlled the meaning, but they couldn't control the long-term consequences. The post-war settlement divided Europe, the Iron Curtain fell, the Cold War began, the Atomic Age started, the colonial empires began their withdrawal. Independence movements gained momentum across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. The Second World War ended the age of empire not because the victors chose to abandon imperial systems, but because the war itself demonstrated that the price of empire exceeds any possible benefit. Britain emerged victorious but bankrupt, forced to give up India within 2 years of war's end. France emerged liberated but weakened, facing colonial wars it couldn't win. The Netherlands emerged from occupation to discover it couldn't reconquer the East Indies. Portugal and Spain, neutral during the war, found their empires becoming anachronisms in a post-war world that increasingly rejected colonial domination. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, but they represented new forms of empire, ideological rather than territorial, though the Soviet Union would maintain direct control over Eastern Europe for 45 years. The fundamental lesson was this: you cannot plunder, slaughter, and steal indefinitely and call it empire. Eventually, the price comes due, the reckoning arrives, the mythology collapses. The veterans who came home carried knowledge that could never be fully communicated. "It hurts you as you get older," one said. "Your memory is not pleasant. I don't blame anybody, but people don't know your problem." The psychological cost cannot be calculated. The moral cost cannot be quantified. The spiritual cost remains beyond measurement. But the historical cost is clear. The Second World War killed the old imperial system, not immediately, not cleanly, but definitively. The Japanese release of only 56 Chinese prisoners from hundreds of thousands captured tells us everything we need to know about the nature of imperial occupation. The 10,000 Germans hanged from lampposts in Berlin for defeatism tells us about the terror required to maintain collapsing systems. The 1,465 kamikaze pilots who died tells us about the human cost of ideological extremism. And the atomic bombs, those 2 moments when the light of 1,000 suns rose in the sky above Hiroshima and Nagasaki, tell us that humanity has acquired the power to destroy itself completely. The next empire that attempts to conquer the world might end the world in the process. That knowledge, born in the fires of total war, reshaped everything. The United Nations formed to prevent another global conflict. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights asserted that all people possess inherent dignity and rights regardless of nationality. The process of decolonization accelerated. The world that emerged from 6 years of total war was fundamentally different from the world that entered it in 1939. The old certainties were gone. The old hierarchies were crumbling. The old empires were dying. Those who fought understood this in ways that those who didn't fight never could. One veteran, coming home to find his dog recognized him when his sister didn't, understood that some connections transcend the chaos of war. Some forms of recognition matter more than empires. Another veteran, hearing Bing Crosby sing "Don't Fence Me In" as his ship carried him home, understood that freedom means more than victory. It means the ability to live without being fenced in by imperial dreams and ideological nightmares. The price of empire was paid by everyone, victors and vanquished, soldiers and civilians, men and women, children and elderly. The bill came due in millions of lives, in centuries of trauma, in the permanent alteration of human civilization. And when the final accounting is made, the conclusion is inescapable. Empire is too expensive. The cost exceeds any possible return. The investment bankrupts the investor. The conquest consumes the conqueror. This is the lesson written in the ruins of Berlin and Hiroshima, in the casualty lists of Okinawa and Stalingrad, in the liberation of prison camps and the fall of colonial systems. This is the lesson that the greatest man-made event in history burned into human consciousness. We are still living with the consequences. We are still paying the price. We are still learning the lesson. The history of the Second World War is not just about battles, strategies, and weapons. It's about the human cost of imperial dreams and ideological extremism. It's about what happens when nations convince themselves they have the right to dominate others. If this story moved you, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. What struck you most about the final chapter of this war? What lessons do you think we've learned or failed to learn? Subscribe to ensure you don't miss our next deep dive into the moments that shaped our modern world. From the fall of empires to the rise of new global orders, history continues to echo in our present. And remember the words of Tacitus, written 2,000 years ago but still true today. They plunder, they slaughter, they steal these things, they misname empire. Those who could have been embraced as liberators were loathed as conquerors. The price of empire was paid in full. The lesson is written in history. The question is whether we'll remember it. Share this documentary with anyone who needs to understand how our world was made and what it cost to make it.